Hey guys, tonight you open your eyes in a world both ancient and alive. The year is 1600. You're standing in the shadow of a towering windmill, its blades turning slow and steady like the tick of some old world clock. The scent of peat smoke clings to the damp air, mingling with salt from the nearby sea. Beneath your boots, the ground squelches. It's newly claimed land, painstakingly wrestled from the water by sheer Dutch stubbornness. Canals gleam like ribbons under a dusky sky. You hear the faint creak of a merchant barge and the laughter of children echoing from a crooked alleyway. It's peaceful, almost sleepy. But don't be fooled. This quiet little republic is about to roar. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy these slow journeys into the Imam past. Let me know in the comments where and when you're listening from. I love seeing the bedtime map grow. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk along the harbor in Amsterdam, and there's a buzz in the air. Not just the flies near the fish stalls, though those are certainly present, but something electric, something weightier. This is a nation waking up, stretching its limbs after decades of war with Spain, ready to chase something bigger than survival. The Dutch Republic, still in its adolescence, is about to set sail on one of the most profitable and brutal adventures the world has ever seen. But for now, everything still feels local. Modest. You pass bakers elbow-deep in dough, craftsmen hunched over ship parts, kids floating in barrels pretending they're ocean explorers. There's pride here, earned one brick at a time. A few decades ago, much of this place was underwater. No, seriously. Whole stretches were little more than swampy marshes. Through dikes, windmills, and the relentless need not to drown, the Dutch turned their soggy patch of Europe into dry land, literally made their country rise out of the sea. You can't help but admire the hustle. You spot a man in thick wool sorting through planks of wood, carefully choosing each one. Shipbuilding is booming, and not just for fishing boats anymore. No, there's a hunger for something greater. Trade, spices, silks, sugar, things that don't grow anywhere near here, and the ships being built now are meant to go far, much farther than any fishing boat has ever dared. Just last year, a fleet returned from the East Indies, the spice-rich archipelago we now call Indonesia, hailed as national heroes. They brought back nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and tales of wild lands filled with opportunity and danger. The spices sold for prices so high they made bakers into barons and sailors into legends. That kind of success doesn't go unnoticed. Suddenly, every merchant and magistrate wants a piece of the action. You slip into a tavern where arguments and ambitions are flowing as freely as the beer. A group of men hunched over maps debate routes past the Cape of Good Hope, as if they're already halfway to the Indies. One man swears his cousin came back with a sack of pepper worth more than the boat had sailed on. Another whispers that the Portuguese are losing their grip on the East. It's open season and the Dutch are licking their lips. It's not just talk. Wealth is already trickling in, reshaping the very bones of the city. You see new warehouses going up. Rows of merchant homes stretching into the sky like proud, crooked teeth. Artists are starting to paint not saints and kings, but brewers, butchers, and burghers. You notice a small oil painting in a shop window. A family plainly dressed but unmistakably rich. Their smiles look almost smug. And you get it. This is a place where people are starting to believe in their own myth, but not everyone's sold on the dream. You overhear an older sailor grumbling into his drink about lost friends and storms off Sumatra. There's talk of mutinies, shipwrecks, diseases that melt you from the inside. And worse, rumors that the riches of the Indies are guarded not just by nature but by people who don't plan on giving them up without a fight. Historians still argue whether the early Dutch expeditions were driven more by desperation or greed, but one thing's clear: they were absolutely willing to gamble lives for cloves. And in a curious twist, it's not kings or queens pulling the strings. The Dutch have no monarch. They're a republic run by a tangled web of cities, provinces, and merchant councils. Power's decentralized, But don't mistake that for weakness. If anything, it makes them more adaptable, more cunning. Like a ship with dozens of small sails, always catching some wind. One odd little detail sticks with you. The Dutch love maps, not just for navigation. They hang them in their homes like art. You see one tonight, tacked onto a tavern wall, all distorted and hopeful, showing Java twice the size it actually is, as if drawing it big enough could make it theirs. That's the thing with empires. They start as lines on paper, then turn into boots on ground. And as you step back into the night, the windmill's silhouette against the moon now feels different. Less quaint, more ominous. Because you know what's coming. A century of expansion, exploitation, and extraordinary wealth built on the backs of others. The Dutch Golden Age is beginning. Not in the golden light of righteousness, but in the glitter of coins and the flicker of cannon fire. You wake up to the sound of water lapping gently at the edges of a dike, and the creak of cartwheels hauling bricks. You're still in the Netherlands, but something's changed. The air smells faintly of ambition, and also cheese, but mostly ambition. You're standing on what was once the bottom of a shallow sea. Seriously, a few generations ago, this whole area was underwater. You take a slow breath and walk along the top of a massive earthen wall, a dike, holding the ocean back like some overachieving sandcastle. Below, you see plots of farmland arranged in perfect rectangles, crisscrossed with canals. You marvel for a moment. The land didn't exist until the Dutch made it. They didn't just conquer territory overseas, they started by conquering water. You pass a family working the soil. The father explains mid-shovel that this was all part of the Beemster Polder project. Swamps drained, fields sown, windmills constantly turning to keep the sea at bay. You nod politely, but your mind is spinning. It's not just agriculture, it's control. The Dutch aren't waiting for nature to offer something up. They're bending it one blade of grass at a time. It's this mindset, this insistence on taming the environment, that begins to define the Dutch path to empire. You watch as towns like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Delft rapidly expand. Not chaotically, but with math. With purpose. You notice that streets are laid out with military precision, canals cut to optimize trade. Ships can pull right up to warehouses. There's no wasted motion, no accidental prosperity. Every inch of progress feels calculated. In the ports, the smell of salt and pitch is everywhere. Men are building ships like it's an Olympic sport. You count the hulls, dozens of them in various stages. The Flight, a clever little vessel designed by the Dutch, is quietly revolutionizing maritime trade. It's wide-bellied and narrow-decked, built not for battle, but for maximizing cargo. It sails faster, carries more, and here's the real kicker, needs fewer crew members, meaning more profit per voyage. You watch one being launched, the crowd cheering like it's the town's newest celebrity. It kind of is. You slip into the back of a town meeting. Technically, you're not invited, but no one's checking. The burgomasters and merchants are debating how to coordinate their shipping routes, share profits, avoid duplicating voyages. It's efficient, sure, but also suspiciously cooperative. One man proposes an idea. What if they form a company, just one, to pool resources and reduce competition? The others scoff, then pause, then nod slowly. The seed of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, is being planted right in front of you. But not everyone's thrilled. In the marketplace, you hear a woman mutter about taxes rising again to fund shipbuilding. Someone else curses the Spanish, still officially in conflict with the Dutch. It's easy to forget that this little republic is still technically at war with one of Europe's superpowers. The 80 Years' War with Spain drags on, yet somehow the Dutch economy booms. You wonder how a small country manages such a balancing act, resisting Spain, expanding trade, and still finding time to argue about cheese prices. You stroll through the University of Leiden, one of the intellectual hubs of the era. Professors debate astronomy, trade policy, and theology, often all in the same breath. There's a weird mix of Renaissance curiosity and business pragmatism here. Scholars are drawing maps based on rumors from sailors, Cartography isn't just science, it's investment advice. Historians still argue whether this mix of open thought and tight economic focus created a unique Dutch innovation culture, or just made it easier to justify colonial expansion with spreadsheets. Then there's religion. You feel it in the architecture, spare, restrained, clean lines. No gold altars or towering cathedrals here. Dutch Calvinism favors simplicity and personal discipline. God's approval, it seems, might be found in a well-balanced ledger. You pass a church service that feels more like a town meeting, practical, serious. Nobody's wearing feathers or swinging incense burners. But it all reinforces the same idea: order, self-control, purpose. You duck into a printing shop, the floor dusted with ink and scraps of rejected pamphlets. The press here isn't just for Bibles. It churns out everything: stock prices, shipping schedules, philosophical tracts, and occasional gossip dressed up as news. The Dutch are some of the most literate people in Europe right now. And what are they reading? Trade reports, voyage accounts, how-to guides for growing tulips. Nothing gets the average Dutch reader excited like profit margins and exotic stories from the Indies. You pick up a pamphlet boasting of a ship returning from Java with a hold full of cloves. The ship made back 10 times its investment. You can't help but smirk. It's not exactly bedtime reading, but it's definitely working as propaganda. You head back toward the water, where a statue of a stoic-looking sailor is being erected. Not a king, not a bishop, a sailor. The national myth is being written, and it's about men who brave storms, not who inherit crowns. A small plaque reads, "He went far for the Republic and farther for profit." Subtle, guys. Real subtle. You squint across the horizon, imagining the routes these ships will take. Past the Portuguese forts, past pirate-infested waters, past disease, mutiny, and bad luck. And yet they keep going. You get the sense this isn't just business anymore. It's identity. Being Dutch means being bold, calculated, and very, very good at turning swamp into empire. And just when you think you've seen all the ambition the land can hold, a child walks past you holding a wooden toy ship. He tilts it in his hands, humming what might be a sailor's tune. You wonder if he knows he's holding a model of the future, or maybe the past, already repeating itself in miniature. The ship beneath your feet groans softly as it rocks in the harbor. You grip the railing, not out of fear, but to steady yourself against the weight of the moment. Today you're setting sail. It's early morning in Amsterdam, and the port is a maze of chaos and choreography. Men shout, barrels thump. Against wood, ropes twist through the air like serpents and gulls wheel overhead shrieking like they've read the headlines. You're climbing aboard a Dutch East Indiaman, one of the mighty trading vessels of the VOC, bound for the fabled spice islands of the East. It smells like pine tar, old fish, and hope. You watch as cargo is loaded with obsessive precision: salted meat, gunpowder, trade trinkets, and, oddly, a few barrels of cheese. Even halfway across the world, the Dutch aren't giving up their Gouda. But tucked beneath all this, locked in reinforced compartments, are the real weapons of conquest: silver, weapons, and printed letters of authorization, legal power wrapped in fancy penmanship. The captain struts the deck, barking orders with the energy of a man who's done this too many times to enjoy it. He eyes you up and down and says, "Hope you're not squeamish about rats." You offer a polite shrug. You've read the letters home, the ship logs, the worried merchant correspondence. You know the voyage ahead won't be smooth. But you didn't expect the floorboards to actually squirm. The journey from the Netherlands to the East Indies is one of the longest sea routes in the world. Over 15,000 nautical miles. Down the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and across the vast Indian Ocean. You'll cross climate zones, dodge pirates, and try very hard not to die of scurvy. Spoiler alert, bring oranges. Days into the voyage, monotony sets in. You spend hours watching the ocean stretch out endlessly in all directions, wondering if this much blue is natural. Crew members pass the time gambling, swearing at ropes, and comparing the smell of their socks. You learn that boredom at sea is almost as dangerous as storms. Almost. Then comes a squall. You wake to the crash of thunder and the sting of salt. In your eyes, sails whip like angry ghosts. The ship lurches, creaks, and seems to briefly consider turning upside down. In the panic, barrels break loose, a sailor is tossed like a rag doll, and the captain clings to the wheel shouting something, unintelligible about blasted Portuguese weather. When it passes, silence returns with eerie swiftness. You look around at the battered faces, the torn canvas, the bruised pride, and you realize this was just a warm-up. You stop at the Cape Colony, present-day Cape Town, a halfway mark founded by the Dutch not long ago to resupply ships like yours. It's a strange mix of peaceful and deeply tense. You see enslaved people from Madagascar, Khoi laborers, Dutch settlers, and mercenaries all occupying the same square but living vastly different realities. A burgher offers you dried meat, with a grin, and just behind him, a man in chains stares blankly past you. Historians still argue whether the VOC intended the Cape to be a permanent colony or just a pit stop that got out of hand. Either way, it becomes clear the Dutch aren't just trading anymore. They're building, holding, replacing the fluid lines of commerce with the harder edges of conquest. Back at sea, the ship crests the final curve around the southern tip of Africa, and the Indian Ocean opens before you like a glittering trap. Here, the Dutch face real competition, not just from nature but from other European powers. The Portuguese have been here for decades, and the English are sniffing around too. You pass a vessel flying a Union Jack and exchange polite cannon fire, just a little maritime flirting. At last, land appears, tropical, green, and pungent with the scent of cloves and possibility. You've arrived in the East Indies, Java, Sumatra, the Moluccas. The names sound like promises. To the VOC, they might as well be synonyms for money. You dock at a VOC-controlled port. The local air is thick with heat and something harder to name: tension. The Dutch have set up forts, warehouses, and offices, often smack in the middle of existing kingdoms. Sometimes, they've brokered treaties. Other times, they've encouraged compliance. You meet a local translator who shrugs when asked what he thinks of the Dutch. Better than the last invaders, he says. Sometimes. You see Dutch traders dressed in fine linen arguing over pepperweights, while armed guards stand nearby. The smell of spice fills the air, but so does gunpowder. There's an uncomfortable truth baked into the daily routine. This isn't just trade. It's power. Every deal is backed by the threat of force. And then there are the middlemen, Chinese merchants, local rulers, Arab sailors, all trying to navigate this shifting landscape. It's a messy web of alliances, betrayals, and quiet resistance. Not everyone wants to be ruled by a ledger book in Amsterdam, but the Dutch keep coming, bringing ships, silver, and, when all else fails, soldiers. A captain boasts over dinner about a cargo hold stuffed with nutmeg worth more than his entire village back home. He laughs, slurps some soup, and doesn't mention that the nutmeg was secured after a small misunderstanding involving cannons and an inconveniently placed village. You're starting to see the pattern. Ships go out, spices come back, profits rise, and somewhere along the line people vanish, cultures bend, and maps change shape. As night falls, you sit by the water, the jungle humming behind you. You think of Amsterdam, so far away, still tidy and humming with trade, and you wonder how many people there know or care what's happening here. You wake with the warmth of tropical air still clinging to your skin, the scent of clove drifting in through the open window like a stubborn reminder. You're not in Amsterdam anymore, and judging by the quiet knock at the door, you're not exactly alone either. A Dutch officer enters the room, crisp uniform, unreadable face, and a ledger clutched under one arm. He's here to oversee the latest negotiation with a local sultan. You tag along, curious, maybe a little nosy, definitely not on the guest list. But no one stops you. After all, you're invisible here. The meeting happens in the shadow of a massive VOC fort. Built from local stone and Dutch arrogance, it squats like a warning to anyone still debating loyalty. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with incense and mistrust. The Sultan arrives in ceremonial garb, flanked by advisors and bodyguards who eye the Dutch like they've read ahead in the script. The negotiations are swift, polite, and wildly lopsided. The Dutch offer protection, trade access, and a barrel of rum. In return, they want a monopoly on the region's nutmeg forever. The Sultan hesitates. That word, forever, does a lot of work. Historians still argue whether these local rulers truly grasped the long-term impact of the contracts they signed, or whether they were cornered by circumstance and cannon fire. Either way, the deal is done. And outside, workers are already preparing cargo crates as if they knew the answer before anyone spoke. You watch as the spice harvest begins. Workers, often enslaved or indentured, moving through groves of nutmeg and clove trees under strict supervision. It's beautiful at a glance, all green leaves and fragrant air, but the closer you look, the harder it is to ignore the chains. The VOC doesn't grow these spices itself. It extracts them, enforces their production, then ships them home at jaw-dropping profit margins. You ride along a jungle trail with a group of Dutch soldiers supposedly on patrol. They're young, sunburnt, bored, and talk about Java like it's a particularly profitable prison. One of them grins and says, "At least the rum's strong and the locals don't shoot straight." He laughs. No one else does. You arrive at a village burned just days earlier. The official story: the locals broke the trade agreement. The unofficial story: they tried to sell nutmeg to the English. You step over smoldering debris, your throat tight. There's no war here, not officially. Just enforcement. You realize, quickly, VOC policy is empire by contract, backed by gunpowder and plausible deniability. Back in the port, a merchant beams as he inspects a new batch of spices. You hear him mutter that one crate of cloves will sell for more than a year's wages back in the Republic. That math becomes irresistible. Other nations are catching on, of course. The English and Portuguese skirmish regularly with the Dutch. Across these islands, trading insults, cannonballs, and bribes. You board a Dutch ship returning home. The captain is smug. He's pulled in a full hold of nutmeg and survived the malaria, pirates, and paperwork. You watch the sailors load the spices below deck, wrapped in oilcloth and reverence. This isn't just cargo. It's the lifeblood of an empire. As the ship cuts across the Indian Ocean, you see the other side of Dutch control. Navigation charts, updated weekly, tight schedules, and an almost cult-like worship of efficiency. Every inch of space is measured, every route calculated to avoid storms and maximize profit. A sailor tells you the VOC tracks every voyage down to the barrel of fresh water and the last ounce of cinnamon. You believe it. Then comes the equator, and with it, the infamous crossing ceremony. You find yourself surrounded by sailors in absurd costumes, shouting as they douse new crew members in salt water and slap them with wet ropes. It's meant to honor Neptune. You suspect it's more about stress relief. Still, it's tradition, and in the VOC, tradition carries weight, especially the ones that end with a mug of grog and a new scar. Back in Europe, VOC ships are starting to arrive more frequently, and each one unloads not just spices, but stories. You picture the auction, rooms of Amsterdam, packed with merchants bidding feverishly over crates of cloves and nutmeg, like gamblers who already know the cards are marked. You overhear one investor tell another, "Every ship that returns triples my money." It's like planting coins and harvesting gold. But somewhere between those glittering returns and the jungles you just left, something important gets lost. Maybe intentionally. You think about the Sultan again, the one who smiled too politely as he signed away centuries of sovereignty. About the burned village, the bored soldier, the merchant who'll never smell smoke or hear the crack of a musket. For many in the Dutch Republic, empire is an abstraction. But for the islands they touch, it becomes daily reality. The VOC isn't just a company anymore, it's becoming a machine. And every gear, every bolt, every man with a title and a feather in his hat believes in its mission. Trade dominance at any cost. You wonder what it feels like to be a cog in something so big. Then you realize, most of them never ask. The sails. Crack in the wind as your ship coasts into Batavia, the VOC's eastern crown jewel. You step onto the dock and feel it instantly, This isn't just a port, it's a statement. Welcome to the city the Dutch built with spices, sweat, and a rather unhealthy obsession with order. Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, isn't so much a city as a colonial blueprint turned reality. Streets cut through it like grid paper, lined with warehouses, mansions, and offices all facing the water, as if bowing to the true monarch here. Trade. Everything smells like salt, cinnamon, and bureaucracy. You walk past men in starched collars barking orders at enslaved laborers hauling crates. The city is designed to be a perfect Dutch replica, except it's sitting on tropical soil and built on the bones of another culture. A little Holland in the east, one officer boasts, gesturing at a canal so choked with mosquitoes it practically hums. Historians still argue whether Batavia was meant to be a long-term settlement or simply a giant vault for VOC operations. Whatever the case, it's clear this place is more than a spice depot. It's where policy becomes reality, where colonial dreams are cemented in brick, marble, and blood. You find yourself in the city's bustling center, where merchants shout prices in a cacophony of Dutch, Malay, Chinese, and Portuguese. A child darts past you with a stolen mango, chased by a guard who's too hot and too tired to care. Above it all, the VOC headquarters looms like a judge's bench. From here, men with powdered wigs issue commands that shape entire continents. They sip coffee brewed from beans grown on land seized by force and dictate treaties with the stroke of a quill. Inside one of these grand offices, you watch a meeting unfold. The Director General of the VOC leans back in his chair while his aides read out reports. Spice yields, shipping delays, unrest in a local village. You'd think they were discussing inventory, not human lives. The solution to rebellion? Reorganize. Leadership. Translation. Replace the local prince with someone more cooperative. Like his cousin, who just happened to be educated in Amsterdam. That's how empire works here. Quietly, systematically, and with just enough paperwork to feel clean. But you notice the guards stationed at every door. The VOC knows its hold is always just one riot away from unraveling. Outside, you pass a parade of enslaved people being sold. They're from all over. India, Africa, the archipelago itself. Some wear branded iron collars, others just stare into space. A man next to you scoffs, company property. The words slip out of his mouth like he's talking about chairs. You bite your tongue. Later, you visit a private Dutch home, one of the larger ones with a red-tiled roof and walls painted a shade of optimism. The owner, a high-ranking VOC administrator, invites you in for tea. His wife fans herself while the servants glide silently around the room. She chats about the heat, the latest fashions from The Hague, and how difficult it is to find good help out here. You glance out the window and see two boys being whipped for dropping a crate. The couple smiles like this is just Tuesday. Even in their leisure, the Dutch make commerce. The city's social life revolves around status, rank, and profitability. Marriages are arranged like mergers. Daughters are sent back to Europe for education, or to be married off as assets. Sons are trained to take their father's chair at the long table to wear the powdered wig and sign the treaties. And then there's the food. Dutch staples like salted herring and cheese still feature, but the East has begun to seep into the menu. Spices, coconut milk, strange new fruits. The colonists adapt, at least on the surface. Underneath, there's an ongoing tension. How much of the East can they absorb without becoming tainted? A VOC officer jokes over dinner that his child prefers rice to rye bread. The horror, he laughs. Everyone joins in. You wander. The narrow alleys behind the mansions where locals live cramped in huts built from whatever materials they can scavenge. Disease spreads easily here. Cholera, dysentery, things that never make it into VOC shipping manifests. A young woman tells you quietly that her brother disappeared after joining a group that resisted VOC land grabs. Her eyes are tired, her voice calm, too calm. You ask a passing Dutch official about unrest. He shrugs and says the locals are naturally emotional, that they don't understand trade like the Dutch do, as if fairness requires tulips and windmills to make sense. One night, a fire breaks out in the city. Sparks catch quickly in the dry wooden structures. You join the bucket line, the chaos lit by red, flickering light, and the sounds of shouted orders in a dozen languages. Dutch officials focus on saving their warehouses. The local quarter is left to burn. The next morning, ash still rains from the sky. The VOC logs the incident as minor infrastructure damage. A missionary passes by, later that day, handing out Dutch language Bibles to people who can't read Dutch. He says he's saving souls. You wonder if anyone's asked the souls what they want. As you sit near the canal that evening, listening to the croaking frogs and distant shouts, you can't shake the feeling that this city, this tidy, brutal machine, is the truest face of the VOC. It isn't just ships and spices anymore, it's urban planning as control. It's contracts disguised as compassion. It's a company that acts like a country. And somewhere in the shaded veranda of a mansion, a man writes a letter home about how beautiful Batavia is in the moonlight. The air shifts again as you step away from Batavia, this time to a place less remembered in Dutch textbooks and more whispered about in archipelago night markets, the Banda Islands. Tiny specks on the map, but each one a gold mine of nutmeg. Literally. The VOC didn't just want control here. They wanted exclusivity. And they were willing to erase everything that stood in the way. You arrive by ship, floating past volcanic peaks and thick green jungle, the scent of nutmeg thick enough to taste. It would be idyllic, if not for the silence. Not peaceful silence. Empty silence. Like a village after something awful. Which, as it turns out, is exactly right. You find yourself walking through abandoned gardens once rich with nutmeg trees, now strangely tidy, like someone tried to clean up history with a broom. A guide, one of the few locals remaining, tells you the story. His voice is dry, practiced. He's told it before. When the Bandanese resisted VOC monopolies, when they dared trade with the English, the Dutch didn't send more negotiators. They sent John Peter Zoon Cohen, Cohen, a name carved into statues in Dutch squares and whispered like a curse here. Historians still argue whether Cohen was a necessary architect of Dutch expansion or a brutal tyrant drunk on his own doctrine of order through violence. Either way, his orders were simple: make an example, and he did. In 1621, Cohen led a campaign on Banda that would forever define the Dutch colonial reputation. Thousands of Bandanese were killed, starved, or enslaved. Some fled, some resisted, but most disappeared into history's blind spot. A culture wiped off the map so the VOC could control a single spice. That's not a metaphor. That happened. You wander the island's shores where the ocean doesn't seem to care what's buried just beneath the sand. Dutch forts still loom on the hills, weathered now, softened by moss. But they're still here, like scars. A colonial footprint that refuses to fade. A Dutch soldier once wrote in a letter home that Banda smelled like paradise but looked like hell. You get what he meant. The nutmeg groves were replanted by slaves, many of them brought from other islands, imported people for an exported product. Even today, traces of African and South Asian lineage remain in the Banda population, a quiet testament to how far the VOC was willing to go to manufacture control. And it worked. After Banda, no one dared challenge Dutch monopoly for a long while. Other islands saw what happened and chose the quieter path of cooperation. You don't blame them. You watch a ship arrive, loaded with freshly harvested nutmeg. Dutch officers inspect the cargo like it's treasure, and to them it is. At one point, nutmeg was worth more than gold. It wasn't just used for flavor. People believed it cured the plague, that it extended life, that it smelled like wealth. So when you hear someone say people died for this spice, it's not poetic license. Back in Amsterdam, nutmeg is now in everything. Perfumes, medicine, food, even handkerchiefs. One merchant proudly tells investors, "We've turned air into profit." You wonder if he knows where it came from, if he cares. Probably not. You see a ledger listing the profits from Banda that, here. It reads like a lottery ticket, staggering numbers all from a few small islands. You hear a clerk mutter, "Thank Cohen for that." Another one says, "He brought peace." The first one laughs. Peace? Sure. Graveyard peace. Cohen becomes a household name in the Dutch Republic. Statues go up. Streets are named. He's praised as a hero who secured Dutch supremacy in the Indies. In classrooms, children recite his victories like scripture, but not the blood. That part's edited out. You travel next to another Banda island, Pulau Run. It's lush, wild, and strangely familiar. Why? Because this was the island the English claimed during their brief alliance with the Bandanese. In fact, they fought over it fiercely with the Dutch for years. It was so contentious, in fact, that when a truce was finally brokered decades later, the Dutch agreed to give up a distant English settlement in exchange for Pulau Run. That English outpost? New Amsterdam, later renamed New York. Yes, really. The Dutch traded Manhattan for nutmeg. Historians love to debate whether that was a fair trade. At the time, it was. Nutmeg was more valuable than land, but it's also the perfect image of the VOC's worldview. Empire not measured in flags, but in spices and silver. A city for a tree. On Pulau Run, you sit near a grove of nutmeg trees. They look innocent, peaceful, but each one might as well be carved from bone and blood. They grow quietly, oblivious to the price of their existence. At night, you hear local songs, ancient ones, full of loss and longing. The Bandanese remember, even if the textbooks didn't. You walk past a crumbling Dutch fort on the island, half swallowed by jungle. Vines wrap around old cannon ports. Inside, bats sleep in the rafters. It's quiet here too, but it feels different from Bandanera. Not hollow, not ashamed, just enduring. You wonder how much of empire is about forgetting. About building monuments high enough to block out the screams. Cohen certainly tried, but the land remembers. And now, so do you. You hear it before you see it. The rhythmic creak of the ship's boards, the moan of the ropes, the splash of waves tapping against the hull like a distant heartbeat. You're deep in the hold of a Dutch East India Company vessel now, crouched among barrels of spice, cannonballs, and shackles. The air is thick with salt and sweat and something else, something heavier. You shift slightly, and your foot knocks against an iron chain, cool and quiet, coiled like a sleeping snake. You're not a passenger anymore. You're part of the cargo, not literally. You're still free to move. But around you, others are not. You can't see them clearly in this dimness, but you feel their presence. Bodies packed side by side, no space to stretch, barely space to breathe. Some hum lullabies in forgotten tongues. Others stay completely still, beyond exhaustion. The human cargo is silent, but the silence screams. This is the Dutch slave trade, efficient, brutal, and deeply entangled with empire. The VOC may have been a corporate juggernaut chasing spice routes and trade monopolies, but it didn't hesitate to traffic in human lives when it served the bottom line. Thousands were transported from Africa to Batavia, from India to Ceylon, and all points between. It's not as famous as the transatlantic slave trade, but make no mistake, it was just as cruel. The Dutch didn't invent slavery, of course, but they industrialized it. They put it in ledgers. They optimized it. Some captains were rewarded for delivering undamaged slaves. Others made quiet profits by selling off surplus human beings at side ports. There's one case where a captain, faced with a food shortage, allegedly tossed a dozen enslaved people overboard to avoid insurance penalties. Historians still argue whether this was a rare atrocity or just one that happened to get documented. You climb the narrow ladder and emerge onto the deck, squinting in the tropical light. Above, a lookout shouts something, land perhaps, the coast of Java maybe. But the ship itself is a floating contradiction. On the one hand, discipline, naval precision, men in uniform, clean brass, and order. On the other, forced labor, disease, and chains rusting from the spray. There's a kind of surreal logic here. The Dutch prided themselves on order, yet their empire thrived on disorder for others. Below deck, enslaved people come from all over: Angola, Madagascar, Bengal, Makassar. VOC records are obsessed with numbers, quantity, age, origin, defects. But you know better. These aren't statistics, these are stories. A mother who bartered herself for her child's safety. A fisherman who knew the names of 20 currents, and now scrubs decks in silence. A girl who once danced on cliff tops and now rocks gently in a hammock of rope and fear. The VOC didn't only rely on enslaved labor in faraway colonies. Even in Batavia, the so-called jewel of the Indies, over half the population was enslaved at its peak. You walk the streets there now, past spice markets and Dutch-style houses, and you notice something odd. The work never stops. Porters haul, cargo from dawn to dusk. Kitchens burn all night. Plantations bloom like clockwork, but no one smiles. You realize the system runs on forced silence. And here's the twist. The Dutch were seen, by themselves and others, as champions of liberty. Freedom of trade. Freedom of religion. Amsterdam was a refuge for Jews fleeing the Inquisition. Philosophers like Spinoza wrote radical tracts just miles from stock exchanges funding slaving voyages. It's enough to make your head spin. Like a ship's wheel caught in a moral whirlpool. You lean against the railing now, staring into the blue-green sea. You think of the countless who didn't survive this journey. Disease, suicide, punishment. One Dutch manual actually suggested keeping enslaved people moderately fed to avoid rebellion, but not so well fed that they become sluggish. You shiver. The language of control disguised as care. Not every Dutchman supported slavery, of course. Some theologians argued it contradicted Christian values. Others, like a few brave pamphleteers in the 17th century, warned that building wealth on suffering would bring divine judgment. But those voices were quiet, and the prophet was loud. Loud enough to drown almost anything out. One odd fringe detail sticks with you. In Suriname, Dutch plantation owners believed that enslaved Africans had magical powers. So they buried nails under doorways to ward off curses and paid for charms from enslaved priests, while still whipping them the next morning. It's the cognitive dissonance of empire distilled into one sweaty superstition. You descend into the hold once more before the ship reaches harbor. A child sleeps curled against a barrel, chained to her mother. You want to reach out. You want to unbuckle the rusted clasp. But this is a memory, not a mission. You're only passing through. Soon the cargo will be offloaded. Some to market, some to mines, some to fields they'll never leave. And the ship? It'll be scrubbed, resupplied, and sent back out. One more silent cog in a very noisy machine. The Dutch Golden Age sails on, but you see the truth now. It isn't just gilded, it's soaked. Soaked in brine and blood and the sweat of unseen hands. And as the sails rise and the wind catches, the ship creaks forward once more, into profit, into power, and into the pages of a history too often whispered. You step off the ship and your boots sink into dry red dust. The sun beats down like it's been waiting for you personally. Welcome to the Cape of Good Hope, a place that was never supposed to be more than a pit stop. A watering hole for tired sailors, a garden for fresh vegetables, a waypoint between Europe and Asia. And yet, the moment you take in the jagged mountains behind you and the deep blue curve of the bay ahead, you know this place is going to be more than a snack break on the imperial road trip. It's the mid-1600s, and the Dutch are setting up camp. Not a colony, not yet. Just a little refreshment station. That's the official story anyway. But you notice how quickly this station becomes a settlement, then a fortress, then a town. The VOC plants cabbage and cabbages turn into fences, and fences turn into lines drawn in blood. At first, the Khoikhoi, indigenous pastoralists with a rich oral tradition and an eye for cattle, are wary but curious. They trade with the newcomers, offer meat and milk. You watch as Dutch hands and Khoikhoi hands pass goods back and forth, an uneasy handshake across cultures. But it doesn't take long before the handshake becomes a shove. The Dutch want land. The Khoikhoi have land. The VOC solution? Simple. Fence off some unused land, ignoring the fact that nomadic herding doesn't leave neat property lines, and declare it company territory. When protests come, they send muskets. You flinch at the first gunshot, it's not the last. Still, some Dutch settlers want more than just to follow company orders. They're the free burghers, former VOC employees given permission to farm and live independently. You meet one now, a leathery man with a tobacco-stained beard and a proud little vegetable patch. He doesn't call himself a colonizer. He calls himself a pioneer, a man of faith, a builder of civilization. He doesn't mention the displaced Khoikhoi family who used to graze goats where his squash now grows. You start to notice how the VOC manages this outpost like a company project. Bureaucracy in boots. Every cow counted, every garden taxed. Even marriages require VOC approval. It's part startup, part surveillance state. And while the Free Burgers farm, the VOC imports labor. First, indentured servants from Europe, then enslaved people from Madagascar, India, Indonesia. The cultural mix is explosive, but no one's sharing the recipe. You walk through the early Cape Town streets. Sand, thatch, sweat, and suspicion. Dutch Calvinists, Muslim exiles, enslaved Africans, local tribespeople. It's a stew of humanity, with an iron lid clamped down. You hear prayers in 3 languages. You smell spices from 5 regions. You see people who know the ocean better than their own homes. But beneath the swirl of culture, there's a pattern forming, one of power and punishment. Historians still argue whether the Cape Colony was meant to become permanent, or whether it simply mutated beyond VOC control. Either way, you're watching. The roots twist downward now. The VOC doesn't want to govern a full-blown society. It wants a service station. But people aren't cogs, and empires never stop growing when there's profit involved. A quirky fact catches your attention. The Dutch at the Cape are obsessed with gardens, like really obsessed. They map out vegetable plots with military precision. Jan van Riebeek, the colony's founder, writes page after page about lettuce yields and how to keep peas from sulking in the heat. Some argue this fixation isn't just about food, it's about control, domestication. You tame the land, and maybe you tame the people too. And yet, the land pushes back, the mountains leak into dreams, the animals won't behave, the weather flips moods like a spoiled child. You understand why the Khoikhoi held ceremonies for the wind and why they read the stars like text messages from their ancestors. This place has a pulse, and it doesn't like being fenced. Still, the VOC tightens its grip. Forts are built. More. Land is claimed. More people displaced. You visit a Khoikhoi camp burned the week before. Ashes, hoofprints, silence. You wonder if anyone still believes this is just a refreshment station. Then there's the matter of disease. European germs hitch a ride and tear through local communities with casual cruelty. You see entire villages coughing themselves into ghost towns. One settler casually blames bad air. Another thanks God for the sudden drop in resistance. You feel the wrongness in your bones. Despite all this, the colony grows. Not always neatly. Not without rebellion. Some enslaved people escape into the hills and form hidden communities. Some burghers grumble against VOC taxes and start seeing themselves as Africans, not Europeans. The Dutch may have built the house, but they can't always control who moves into which room. You pass a field where vines curl around poles, early vineyards. A burly man is teaching his son to prune. Wine will become one of South Africa's proudest exports. But tonight you just note the irony. Joy fermenting on contested ground. As dusk settles, you climb Signal Hill and look out over the growing colony. Lanterns flicker in houses built from dreams and denial. Ships sway gently in the harbor, their holds full of spice, silk, and stolen lives. You breathe in the strange cocktail of ocean and ambition, and you realize something. This isn't a side quest in the Dutch Empire story. It's a hinge, a place where the world tilts. From here, ships fan out to 3 continents. From here, language and power twist into something new. And from here, the Dutch Empire stops being just a trading network. It becomes a land-hungry machine, always thirsty for more. And somewhere out there, beyond the ridge, the Khoikhoi are still watching. Still remembering what this place used to be. The silver glints in your palm like moonlight made solid. Cold, dense, and unnervingly heavy for something so small. You roll it between your fingers. A Spanish piece of 8. One of the most traveled objects in early modern history. But it didn't land here by accident. You're standing on a Dutch dock now watching silver, chests of it, coins, ingots, disappear into the belly of another ship bound for the east. The Dutch don't mine this silver. They barely even touch the mines, but they move it like no one else. The funnel is wide at the top. Bolivia, Peru, Mexico. Spanish ships haul silver from the New World to Europe, and that's when the Dutch step in. You follow it from Seville to Amsterdam, where it gets cleaned, clipped, sometimes reminted, and sent eastward. It's a magician's trick, turning colonial pain into coin, then coin into clove, silk, and porcelain. All roads may lead to Rome, but all silver eventually slides toward Asia. You step inside the Amsterdam Whistle Bank, the city's mighty exchange bank, and it's quieter than a church. Vaults thud shut. Clerks scratch out figures in ledgers so large they need both arms to turn the pages. You get the distinct feeling that if you sneezed here, you'd destabilize a dozen regional economies. This place doesn't just store wealth, it regulates trust. And in a world of pirates, storms, and overambitious monarchs, trust is more valuable than gold. A Dutch merchant whispers it proudly, silver in, spices out. He's not wrong. You trace the route next. Dutch ships sail eastward, to India, Ceylon, Siam, and most importantly, China and Japan. You peer over a trader's shoulder in Batavia as he negotiates a shipment of silk, fans, and rare ceramics. The seller won't accept cloth, not timber, not even gold, only silver. And so the silver funnel narrows. Most of it ends up in China, where the Ming and later Qing dynasties demand silver taxes. China, giant and unyielding, is a sponge for silver. You watch bales of it vanish behind lacquered gates, feeding a system that barely registers Europe's existence. To them, the Dutch are just another speck in the tide. It's a strange moment. The Dutch Empire, so loud elsewhere with its cannons and contracts, becomes almost quiet here. They don't conquer China. They barely get past its border. But they do something just as powerful. They become indispensable middlemen, brokers of the world's most coveted goods. Your role now isn't colonizer or soldier, it's courier. Middle-class empire with maximum reach. One quirky detail floats up. To impress Chinese officials, Dutch ships often carried miniature windmills as diplomatic gifts, tiny rotating symbols of their homeland's ingenuity. You watch one twirl in, a breeze atop a lacquered box, and it's somehow both charming and desperate. "Please like us," it whispers. "We brought clever toys and tons of silver." But things aren't always smooth. In Japan, for example, you crouch on the man-made island of Dejima in Nagasaki Bay, a tiny Dutch trading post walled off from the mainland. The Japanese have expelled all other Europeans, especially the Spanish and Portuguese, for spreading Christianity. Only the Dutch remain, because they've agreed to keep their theology to themselves. You're one of the lucky few allowed to set foot on shore, and even then only during highly scripted ceremonies. It's business in a pressure cooker, polite, precise, and constantly watched. Historians still argue whether this role, as neutral trader, not aggressive conqueror, was a strategy or a necessity. The Dutch couldn't have overpowered China or Japan even if they'd tried, but instead, they found a quieter empire. One built not on gunpowder, but on fine print and favorable exchange rates. You sit in a warehouse in Batavia now, watching coins get counted by candlelight. Some are chipped, some worn smooth from thousands of hands. One clerk mutters that every coin smells faintly of blood, Spanish, African, or indigenous. You don't disagree. The money that passes through these fingers might have started in a Bolivian mine, worked by enslaved Quechua laborers, traded through Manila, rerouted in Dutch hands, and now it disappears again. And here's the irony. While silver enriches the East and empowers Dutch traders, it doesn't stay in the Netherlands for long. The country becomes a financial hub, not a hoarder. Silver flows through Amsterdam like a river, never settling. You picture the city as a sponge full of holes, slick with transactions, drained dry at night and filled again by morning, and back, home. Dutch citizens are already reaping the benefits. New houses, new banks, new art. but also rising inequality. Silver doesn't trickle down so much as trickle sideways, into the pockets of those who already own ships and shares. There's a boom, yes, but it's the kind of boom you can hear echoing longest in the counting rooms. Another oddity hits you as you study one final ledger. Many Dutch traders, while exporting silver to Asia, were also importing counterfeit coins to Europe. A shadow trade in fake Spanish dollars, good enough to fool inland merchants but rejected by seasoned clerks in Batavia. So naturally, the VOC kept the best for Asia and passed the fakes to unsuspecting Germans. Classic. The silver funnel works because of trust, timing, and a willingness to squeeze every moral corner. You step back onto a ship now, sails tight, with wind, silver sealed in crates below. You're not sure where it'll end up, China, Japan, Siam, but you do know this, it won't stop moving. The Dutch Golden Age isn't built on what stays, it's built on what flows, and tonight, as the sun dips behind the deck casting shadows across the crates, you feel the weight again. Not of the silver, but of everything it touched on its long, glittering journey. You lean forward into the wind, the deck beneath your feet groaning with the familiar rhythm of the sea. Another Dutch ship cuts across the Atlantic, and you're on board again. Sails, snapping, ropes creaking, the crew shouting in a mix of languages, but look closer. This isn't just a boat. It's a floating spreadsheet. A machine of profit and loss, driven as much by math as by muscle. This is how the Dutch tamed the sea, through science, structure, and a dash of stubborn luck. You wander below deck and find charts, maps, compasses, and something that looks suspiciously like a protractor's edgy cousin. Dutch navigators, those stern-faced types who wouldn't smile if Neptune offered them a drink, weren't just sailors. They were data nerds with sea legs. You see them calculating latitudes with astrolabes, adjusting sails based on wind patterns logged over generations. This is no guesstimate voyage. This is a plotted course with wind roses inked into the margins. It hits you. Dutch ships weren't faster than others, they were smarter, more efficient, smaller even, but built to last and sail close to the wind. A sailor boasts to you that a Dutch Floyd can carry twice the cargo with half the crew of any English ship. He's exaggerating, but not by much. The Floyd is a game changer. Cheaper to build, easier to steer, less taxed in foreign ports because of its innocent, round-bellied design. You chuckle. It looks like a bread loaf that learned to sail. Above deck, the air smells like salt and something worse, livestock. That's right. Some ships carried live chickens and pigs on board to provide food on long voyages. One sailor refers to them as self-walking rations. You decide not to ask about the hygiene situation. Still, not everything is precise. You pass a sailor tattooing a mermaid on his bicep while singing about ghost ships off the Cape. Superstition still grips this world. Dead calm waters are bad omens, and dolphins swimming alongside are considered lucky. The stars are charted, yes, but they're also whispered to. Even in a rational empire, saltwater makes room for stories. Then there's the VOC bureaucracy. You thought the ship's helm was in charge? Nope. There's a paper trail thicker than the sails. Every voyage is logged, reported, reviewed. You watch a ship's purser hunched over his journal like he's guarding national secrets. Lists of goods, crew, weather, even the number of rats spotted on board, yes, really, are inked in painstaking detail. The Dutch don't just sail, they quantify. But for all their planning, accidents still happen. A sudden storm cracks the mainmast, in half like a twig. You grip the railing as sailors scramble. One is knocked overboard, his scream swallowed by waves. No one looks surprised. The sea always takes its toll. Another man tells you dryly, the ocean's like a tax collector. You don't know when it's coming, but it always comes. Historians still argue whether the Dutch truly mastered maritime trade, or if they just happened to peak while others stumbled. Spain was tangled in war and bankruptcy. Portugal stretched too thin. England still finding its sea legs. But regardless, you're living the moment when Amsterdam becomes the world's shipping nerve center. Not because the Dutch invented ships, but because they optimized them, and optimized they did. You pass barrels stored in mathematically precise stacks. Every inch of space is calculated. Ballast stones are swapped to balance cargo loads. Even the deck rails are lower than other nations. Less wood, less weight, more cargo. Dutch pragmatism strikes again. Here's a fringe tidbit. VOC captains were often forbidden to marry until they completed a profitable voyage. The logic? A family is a distraction, and nobody sails their best when they're dreaming of tulip. Season back home. Romantic? Hardly. Effective? Apparently. As days stretch into weeks, you notice the rhythm of shipboard life. Dawn watch, midday meal, sunset log, salted cod and weevil-laced biscuits are dinner staples. One sailor insists that eating the weevils builds character. Another just flicks his onto the deck for the chickens. And so the food chain on board continues. You spend a moment in the crow's nest, the wind slapping your cheeks. Below, the sea spreads endlessly. The sky is an inverted bowl of steel blue light. It's beautiful, terrifying. In a world without engines or Google Maps, it's hard to believe anyone ever made it anywhere. Yet the Dutch do. Again and again. Their routes, Amsterdam to the Cape, to Batavia, to Japan, become clockwork. So predictable that pirates eventually stop bothering. So efficient that rival nations send spies to study Dutch shipbuilding. So profitable that entire cities back home swell with wealth from every returning tide. But there's a cost. The sea takes lives, yes, but also changes them. You talk with a young sailor who hasn't seen his hometown in 8 years. Another forgot how to write in Dutch. A third dreams only in waves. The longer the voyage, the less anyone resembles the person they once were. As night falls again, you sit by a lantern on the lower deck. The ship rocks gently, like a lullaby sung in rope and timber. Somewhere overhead, an officer shouts the coordinates. Someone laughs below, probably the weevil guy again. You listen, breathing in the smell of salt, tar, and too many humans in close quarters. You're floating, yes, but anchored in a story of math, muscle, and maritime ambition. Here, among maps and mermaids, the Dutch Empire sails forward. Not just with force, but with formulas, not just guns, but geometry. They don't just conquer new worlds, they calculate them. You tiptoe now, not across a battlefield or a dockside warehouse, but through a garden. Tulips bloom in brilliant rows, striped, speckled, marbled. Their petals flare open like tiny flames, and the soil smells rich, almost smug. You're in Haarlem, a sleepy Dutch town that's suddenly the epicenter of one of history's strangest economic dramas. This isn't war. It's a flower frenzy. It starts quietly. A few wealthy enthusiasts collect rare tulip bulbs imported from the Ottoman Empire. You kneel beside a gardener who explains how a single bulb can grow into a bloom, so unique it might never be replicated. Like owning a living painting, he says. Then he pats the dirt like it's holding secrets. It is. What you don't see, at least not yet, is the market bubbling underneath. Traders, nobles, and barbers alike begin speculating on tulips, betting, not on flowers, but on futures. You blink and suddenly you're watching a man trade a tulip bulb for a carriage, 2 horses, and a townhouse. The bulb isn't even blooming, just a promise in a pot. You peek into a smoky tavern and witness an auction. Men shout numbers, scribble contracts, shake hands furiously. The bulb in question, it's nowhere in sight. This is paper speculation, an early derivatives market where the bulb never even changes hands, just the right to maybe own one someday. One merchant whispers, "The Semper Augustus is worth more than my house." You glance at his house later. It's huge. Historians still argue whether the tulip mania was truly an economic bubble or just a speculative blip, amplified by later storytellers. But in the moment you feel it, the fever, the belief that beauty, rarity, and risk could combine into profit. Even the tulips seem to watch with wry amusement. Meanwhile, the Dutch Golden Age is in full bloom. Art, science, commerce, all rising. You hear murmurs that a flower market makes perfect sense in a country that turns swamp into farmland and trade into an empire. After all, why shouldn't the people who gamble with the sea also gamble with petals? Here's the quirky part. The most valuable tulips, the ones that fetch mansion-level prices, aren't just rare, they're sick. A virus, later called the tulip-breaking virus, infects the bulbs and causes those unique streaks and flames. You stare at one now, glorious, in its asymmetry. It's beautiful because it's diseased, a metaphor if ever there was one. As winter closes in, contracts pile up. No one wants the actual bulbs yet. It's not planting season. You watch a fishmonger, a chimney sweep, even a baker's wife sign on to get rich come spring. It's not just the wealthy anymore. The madness has trickled down. Then it pops. Maybe a buyer backs out. Maybe prices just rise too fast. Maybe someone finally remembers. It's just a flower. Either way, in Harlem one February morning, a tulip auction goes silent. No bids, no sales, you can almost hear the collective gulp. In the days that follow, contracts are canceled, debts called in, fortunes erased. The baker's wife? She's back to kneading dough and pretending the tulips were a dream. You walk through the same garden again. Same soil, same petals, but a different silence. The mania is over. The flowers remain. What doesn't fade is the story. Writers mock the mania, for centuries afterward calling it the height of irrational speculation. Economists study it as an early warning sign of bubbles to come. And you, sitting on a bench by a pond filled with floating petals, feel the weirdness of it all. A nation, built on trade and reason, briefly fell in love with something as fragile and fleeting as a flower. But not all is lost. The tulip survives, after all. It becomes a national symbol. The Netherlands remains one of the top flower exporters in the world. And somewhere in the archives of a bank, a single piece of parchment still records the day a Semper Augustus sold, for the price of a canal house. You pass a young artist sketching a tulip by candlelight. He tells you he's not rich, but the petals speak to him. They're soft as silk and sharper than coins, he says. And he's right. They shimmer with both delicacy and danger, a reminder that even in an age of ships and ledgers, desire can outpace reason. And when it does, even a tulip can become a revolution. By nightfall, the markets have moved on. Ships still sail, spices still arrive, and coins still clink in the counting houses. But the echo of the flower bubble lingers. You see it in the cautious eyes of traders, in the tighter fists of lenders, in the way every blooming garden now carries just a hint of caution. And as the last petal falls from a Semper Augustus, delicate, bright, absurdly expensive in its day, you realize the Dutch didn't just build an empire of gold. They built one on belief. And sometimes belief blooms too far. You duck beneath a low stone arch and step into a studio thick with the smell of linseed oil, old paper, and something faintly chemical, though no one here would call it that. The light slants through high leaded windows, illuminating a canvas in progress. A woman in a pearl earring turns slightly, forever just out of reach. This is the Dutch golden age of art, and while you watch paint dry, literally, there's another story unfolding just outside the frame. The room is crowded, but not with people. Objects fill every shelf, table, and pocket of space. Globes, skulls, Persian carpets, half-peeled lemons, silver goblets catching the light just so. Each brushstroke turns domestic clutter into glory. But here's the twist. As Dutch art rises to sublime new heights, the empire that pays for it drips quietly with blood. You stroll through Amsterdam's galleries, pausing at canvases that seem almost too real, bread that looks fresh enough to eat, lace so delicate you swear you can hear it rustle. But then your eye catches something else. A dark-skinned servant in the background carrying a tray, a monkey on a golden chain, a map on the wall, territories marked like trophies. The empire is here too, hiding in plain sight. One artist explains, between dabs of umber and ultramarine, that these items weren't just props. They were symbols. A globe meant knowledge, a peeled lemon, beauty and bitterness, a seashell, exoticism, and sometimes the vanity of collecting. You nod, though you're still stuck on the monkey. It stares at you, unblinking, as if it knows more than it's letting on. Historians still argue whether Dutch painters intended social commentary, or if they were just decorating wealthy homes with pretty things. Was the art quietly critical, or cheerfully complicit? You lean toward the former, though that might just be the ASMR hush of the studio getting to you. Meanwhile, the money keeps flowing. Rich merchants commission family portraits the size of mattresses. You sit in on one session as a fur-cloaked man demands a version of himself that looks stern but likable. The painter sighs. You can tell he's had this conversation before. Outside, canals reflect a city swollen with wealth. Amsterdam's art dealers rival its spice traders. Prices rise, new painting schools emerge, and even obscure artists get rich enough to install a second fireplace. Imagine, just for their studio. But you also notice what's missing. No wharves, no plantation scenes, no enslaved people shown suffering. The empire's engine room stays hidden, politely omitted. Still, there are cracks in the canvas. Rembrandt, you'll notice, paints beggars with as much care as bankers. He captures wrinkles, dirt, sadness. You stand over his The Jewish Bride and your chest tightens. It's tender, unflinching. There's no empire here, just love. But Rembrandt dies broke. Turns out, emotional honesty doesn't always pay. Here's your quirky bit. Some artists used arsenic and lead in their paints. That rich yellow, it's literally poisonous. You stare at one still life with suspicious oranges and wonder if the painter ever licked the brush. Probably. Let's be honest. They didn't have TikTok. They were bored. Art guilds thrive. And you wander into one meeting in Delft where artists argue about varnish thickness like it's a matter of life and death. One proposes experimenting with crushed lapis lazuli for a new kind of blue. Another scoffs. Too expensive. He'll probably regret that later. You pause in front of a vanitas painting. A skull, an hourglass, a candle just snuffed out. Reminder, wealth is fleeting. Life is short. The empire, for all its gold, won't last forever. The artist catches your eye and shrugs. People like to be reminded, he says, especially the ones with the most to lose. And maybe that's what Dutch art does best. It masks and mirrors. It lets a merchant see himself as noble, even as his ships return heavy with spice and sorrow. It lets a housewife gaze at a sunlit window and forget, for a moment, the world beyond her block. It sells illusions, but occasionally, accidentally, it tells the truth. You step back outside. The light has changed. Rain gathers on the cobblestones, turning them slick and mirror-like. You catch your reflection, part tourist, part-time traveler, and behind you a gallery window glows warm with paintings of fruit and empire. This is the paradox of the Golden Age. For every perfect still life, there's a life stilled elsewhere. For every gilt frame, a frame of violence. And yet, it's beautiful. Terribly, hauntingly beautiful. As the rain begins to fall, you duck into a doorway and whisper thanks to whatever spirit let you witness this contradiction. And in the glass, behind you, a monkey on a chain blinks once. You hear the clink of coins before you see them. Mountains of silver, meticulously stacked, shimmer in the lamplight of a counting room. Welcome to the real engine of the Dutch Golden Age. Money, measured not just in stacks, but in systems. The VOC didn't just hoard wealth, it designed how wealth moved, expanded, and was weaponized. And tonight, you're about to peek behind the curtain of what may have been the world's first true corporate finance machine. The room smells like ink, wax, and a hint of nervous sweat. You sit across from a VOC accountant who's more feared than admired. His ledgers are legend. This isn't just bookkeeping, it's command and control. Each column tells a story. One ship delayed, one port captured, one governor mysteriously replaced, and one silver shipment finally delivered from Japan. Yes, Japan. Because while the Dutch were building fortresses in the tropics, they were also cultivating something cold, calculated, and exquisitely lucrative in East Asia. Access to the Tokugawa shogunate's rich silver mines. Through Dejima, a man-made island off Nagasaki, the Dutch earned a rare place inside Japan's walled garden of trade. No proselytizing, no meddling, and definitely no missionaries allowed. just silver, in and out. The Japanese respected discipline, and the Dutch offered exactly that, along with microscopes, cannons, and a refreshing lack of holy water. You watch as silver bars are carefully weighed and logged, then whisked away, to be melted down into coins marked with the VOC seal. These coins go everywhere: Java, Ceylon, Persia, Amsterdam. They're the passport of the empire, and every one of them has a story. Back in the Netherlands, you enter the Amsterdam Wisselbank, the city's pride and the foundation of the Dutch banking system. Here, merchants deposit precious metals and receive paper receipts, receipts that start functioning like money themselves. You can feel it happening, trade becoming abstraction, wealth becoming trust, or at least, the illusion of it. Historians still argue whether this was the birth of modern capitalism, or simply the natural next step of medieval accounting taken to an industrial scale. Either way, it was effective, and incredibly risky, because, while VOC shares were sold on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first, mind you, they were not without drama. Shareholders often had no idea what was happening overseas. Reports were delayed by months, often sugar-coated or outright doctored. Rumors of war, mutiny, or shipwreck could cause panic. You sit in on a shareholder meeting, where one frustrated investor pounds the table. "Why did we not get our dividend? Where is the fleet from Ceylon?" The directors smile politely, promise stability, and refill his wine. That's the trick. Keep the money moving. Keep the risk invisible. You trail a shipment of silver across the oceans. First to India, where it buys textiles. Then to Indonesia, where those textiles are traded for spices. Then to Europe, where those spices fund further expeditions. It's a loop. An elegant, brutal loop. A self-feeding machine that requires constant fuel, silver, manpower, and silence. In Ceylon, you visit a warehouse where coins from Japan are exchanged for cinnamon bound for Amsterdam. A worker drops a chest and curses in Tamil. The overseer whips him. You flinch. The chest is repacked, resealed, and blessed, not by a priest, but by a notary. One curious fringe detail you stumble upon. VOC coins were sometimes deliberately misminted, just enough to signal authenticity without copying others. This early branding strategy helped Dutch currency stay dominant, even in regions where the locals didn't speak Dutch or read numbers. Just the feel of the coin was enough. Later, you overhear a conversation between two VOC traders. One grumbles that even their enemies use VOC coins. "We are everyone's banker," he smirks, "and their jailer." At a busy Javanese port, you witness how money reshapes societies. Local rulers, desperate for Dutch coin, adjust their systems to favor VOC demands. Old debts are paid with land. Rice is diverted to feed Dutch garrisons. A merchant jokes that the Dutch don't conquer with guns, they conquer with receipts. It's not far from the truth, and yet the system isn't flawless. You attend a crisis meeting in Batavia after a ship carrying millions in silver vanishes in a typhoon. Panic ripples through the network. One administrator mutters that if 2 more ships are lost, the entire regional economy could collapse. Another calmly replies, "Then raise the spice tax." Problem solved, but cracks are forming. Smuggling, counterfeiting, embezzlement, all sprout like mushrooms in a damp ledger. You spot a mid-ranking official pocketing coins, shaving just enough off the edge to go unnoticed. He smiles at you. "Everyone eats," he says. Some just a little more delicately. And then there's the question no one dares ask. What happens when the silver runs out? You hear whispers about inflation, about entire villages forced to switch from barter to coin-based economies, only to find the coins vanish during shortages. About how control of the mint becomes control of the people. These aren't just shiny tokens, they're handcuffs. You end the night back in Amsterdam watching a new batch of shareholders eagerly buy VOC stock. A boy sells tiny toy ships outside the exchange, and for a second you almost forget what's underneath it all. But then you see a document nailed to a post. A wanted notice for a crew that stole a cargo of silver and disappeared into the Indian Ocean. The reward is enormous. The fine print reads, Property of the United East India Company. Property. Not coin, not spice. Just property. And so the money flows. Your next steps bring you not to a city or port, but into the shadowy corridors of a force that doesn't wear uniforms. Only black hats and sly smiles. Welcome to the world of Dutch privateers and pirates, where the VOC didn't always fight its wars with soldiers. Sometimes it outsourced the dirty work to people who barely qualified as civilized, depending on your definition. And frankly, theirs too. You're aboard a small, fast ship hugging the coast of the Malabar region in India. The flag flutters. It's not VOC, not officially, but everyone knows the deal. The captain is Dutch, but his crew is a chaotic blend of Portuguese renegades, Malay adventurers, and even a former Jesuit-turned-gunslinger. Their job? Harass enemies of the company, intercept ships, seize goods, ask forgiveness later. And yes, they're paid, but not with a salary, with a cut. These men work on commission, which means their motivation is directly tied to the value of whatever they can steal. You see it in their eyes, hungry, calculating. And while the VOC may not publicly admit it, they need these men. You sail alongside a small Portuguese cargo vessel just off the Coromandel coast. Within minutes, cannons roar. The privateers swing aboard like theater pirates. But this isn't a play. The Portuguese sailors are bound, the cargo seized, and the ship scuttled. It's brutal, efficient, and disturbingly normal. The Dutch call this denying resources to our enemies. You call it what it is, sanctioned piracy. Historians still argue whether the VOC's use of privateers blurred the lines of legal warfare or simply reflected the norms of an era when navies were still part mercenary. But what's clear is this. The VOC didn't just operate in gray zones, it thrived in them. You arrive in Mauritius next, then a staging post for these operations. It's a sleepy island with a rough edge. Half refuge, half repair station. You watch a group of pirates refitting their ship while boasting about a haul of Chinese porcelain liberated from a Spanish galleon. The VOC clerk listening pretends to disapprove, then quietly buys half of it at a discount. The blurred boundaries continue in the company's relationship with local rulers. In the Persian Gulf, Dutch ships enforce tolls for access to ports. If you pay, you're protected. If not, well, let's just say your next shipment might be redirected. Protection racket and powder blue uniforms. You recall a quirky tidbit from your time in Batavia. A VOC official once had to mediate a legal dispute between two pirates about whose loot was looted first. The VOC ruled in favor of the one who showed greater initiative. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. In Ceylon, you see another flavor of this policy: economic sabotage. When local cinnamon traders refuse to sell at VOC prices, a mysterious fire destroys their warehouses. No one sees anything, except everyone does. The VOC doesn't just win with ships, it wins by making resistance look like a very bad investment. Meanwhile, Dutch privateers haunt the Indian Ocean like sharks. Their ships are fast, their crews brutal, and their allegiances negotiable. They carry VOC letters of marque, official documents that legitimize piracy. You hold one in your hands. It's written in dense formal Dutch with flourishes of wax and pomp. But it might as well say, "Go break stuff and bring it back." The company, of course, maintains plausible deniability. We don't control them, they say, but we do benefit from their zeal. That's one way to describe someone who just captured a Portuguese galleon off Goa and sold its cargo to a Dutch trader 2 days later. You dock in Malacca, a melting pot of commerce and corruption. Here, pirate ships sell their spoils openly while VOC agents buy them quietly. It's all very civil. Tea is poured. Documents are signed. Loot becomes ledger. And sometimes, the pirates go legit. A famous case, you might enjoy this one, involves a French privateer who fought the Dutch for years before the VOC offered him a job. He accepted, promptly turned on his former allies, and received a small estate in Java for his loyalty. You stand where his house once was. It's now a government office. There's irony for you. But piracy isn't always outsourced. You hear rumors that VOC captains themselves sometimes moonlight as raiders. When ships go missing near rival ports, it's not always the weather. And when a Portuguese settlement mysteriously starves after its food shipments vanish, that's not luck, that's strategy. Back in Amsterdam, the Board of 17, the VOC's top brass, reviews reports. One mentions unauthorized engagements by company ships. Another lists a spike in spice imports with uncertain provenance. They raise eyebrows, then move on to the next item, because in the end, results speak louder than rules. You end the day with a drink in a port tavern, a immersive, classic colonial watering hole, where everyone knows someone who just robbed someone. Stories flow faster than ale. You hear about a privateer who buried treasure near Mauritius, another who married a local queen in Sulawesi, and one who staged his own death to avoid Dutch taxes. That one gets a cheer. Even pirates hate paperwork, and maybe that's the heart of it. The VOC mastered the art of appearing lawful while quietly pulling strings that looked suspiciously like nooses. It built an empire not just on spice, but on whispered deals, forged alliances, and conveniently overlooked crimes. And when you step outside, the sea is calm, the moon reflected in the water like silver. Beautiful. But you can't help wondering how many ships are out there right now. Flags tucked away, sails angled just right, ready to make history disappear beneath the waves. You taste it before you see it, syrupy sweet, cloying on your tongue, laced with heat and something bitter, underneath sugar. That perfect colonial product, white as snow and twice as deadly. You wipe your mouth and step onto the steaming soil of Suriname, where the land glistens with tropical rain and the air buzzes with insects and command. Here, the sugar doesn't come from silver bowls in candlelit salons. It comes from sweat. From backs bent under sun. From cries you're not supposed to hear. You walk the perimeter of a Dutch plantation, where rows of cane stretch toward a blurry horizon, and enslaved workers move through them like shadows, each with a machete in hand, none making eye contact. You weren't supposed to be here, you feel that instantly. Suriname was the Dutch trade-off. Remember how they swapped it with the British for Manhattan? Yep. Turns out they thought sugar was a sweeter deal than a rocky American colony. Spoiler. They weren't wrong, at least not for their ledgers. This place churned out wealth like clockwork, and the engine? Enslaved African laborers worked to the bone in brutal cycles that made the spice trade look like a side hustle. You duck under a corrugated tin roof to escape the rain and watch the sugar process unfold. Cane chopped and bundled, hauled to a mill, crushed between enormous rollers turned by oxen or people when the oxen weren't fast enough. Juice boiled in copper cauldrons so hot the air hums. The smell is nauseating, sweet, scorched, and metallic. You gag. Someone hands you a handkerchief. You see their wrists are scarred. Historians still argue whether Suriname was the most profitable colony the Dutch ever held. But there's no debate on the cost. Mortality rates here were astronomical. Some plantations replaced half their enslaved workforce every few years, not from freedom, no, from death. Disease, overwork, and punishment made life expectancy here terrifyingly short. You meet a Dutch overseer, wide-brimmed hat, clean boots, sips rum like it's lemonade. He brags that his plantation is one of the finest in the Guianas, then makes an offhand joke about a man who tried to run. You don't laugh. He doesn't notice. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some parts of Suriname, enslaved Africans developed a Creole language, Sranan Tongo, blending Dutch, English, Portuguese, and African tongues. It became a lifeline, a secret code, a way to keep culture alive under constant erasure. You hear it spoken softly in the sugar fields, barely louder than the rustling cane. Music, too, snakes through the landscape, carved into rhythms on drums, banned by colonial laws, still played, still surviving. Some run. Deep into the rainforest, you follow whispers of maroon communities, fierce enclaves of escaped slaves who carved out freedom in places too dense for empire to follow. The Dutch tried to crush them with militias and treaties, but the jungle had its own loyalties. You crouch in the underbrush and catch a glimpse of smoke, then laughter, the sound of survival. Back at the plantation house, sugar is ladled into molds, dried, packed, weighed, and sealed. Each block stamped with the owner's insignia, neat, elegant, and utterly detached. This is what will arrive in Europe, in porcelain bowls, beside tea and gossip. The blood has been filtered out somewhere in transit. You watch a ship load up at the Paramaribo docks. Barrels of sugar, crates of coffee, sacks of cotton. Beside them, iron shackles lie discarded on a wooden plank, rusting in the salt air. A sailor kicks them aside like clutter. You feel your stomach turn. You think back to Amsterdam's drawing rooms where chandeliers glint and dainty spoons swirl sweetness into tea. No one there will picture the boiling house or the rows of graves. That's the beauty of distance. And denial. But there's resistance too. You spot coded messages carved into the backs of wooden chairs, passed between workers. There are legends of poison, of sabotage, of secret midwives who taught birth control to sabotage the slave economy's future from within. Power here is not absolute. Not ever. At night, the jungle presses close. You sit by a fire, hearing tales of Anansi the spider, clever, quick, and always underestimated. The stories are funny but layered. Every joke has a sting. Like sugar. And as you drift off beside the river, lulled by cicadas and wind in the cane, you realize the Dutch didn't just refine sugar. They refined a system. One that could turn pain into profit so efficiently, so silently, that it still echoes through recipes and rituals today. Tomorrow more ships will come. More names will be lost. But tonight, here in the dark heat of Suriname, you remember. You listen. And you taste the sweetness for what it really is. You crouch beside a narrow wooden bridge, watching the tide lap quietly against the shores of Dejima. It's barely even an island. More like a man-made sliver of land tacked onto the edge of Nagasaki like a forgotten appendix. And yet, this tiny outpost is where two empires cautiously touch fingers across a divide of suspicion, etiquette, and sheer oddity. Welcome to Japan's only sanctioned foreign whisper during its centuries of self-imposed silence. And guess what? The Dutch are the only ones allowed to speak. The year is somewhere in the 17th century, but time moves differently here. You step onto Dejima's soil after an extremely thorough inspection. You're not smuggling in Bibles, are you? And feel like you've walked into a surreal diplomatic dance. The Japanese shogunate allows the Dutch to trade here, but only under strict rules. You can't leave Dejima. You can't bring women. You can't build churches. And you definitely can't try converting anyone. It's like business class prison. You watch a Dutch trader bow awkwardly to a Japanese interpreter. Too low, not low enough, who knows, and hand over a bundle of telescopes and fine cloth. In return, lacquerware, porcelain, and information. That last one is the most valuable of all. The Dutch may be merchants, but here they are also human routers, carrying news between two civilizations that mostly pretend the other doesn't exist. You sit in on one of the shogun's annual knowledge deliveries, where a Dutch physician is escorted under armed guard to Edo, modern Tokyo, to share the latest from Europe. A new surgical tool, a planetary chart, a book on Dutch law that's accidentally now a Japanese bestseller. The physician keeps his eyes down and his metaphors vague. The samurai aren't known for patience with tangents. Here's your fringe detail. Dutch traders were sometimes required to perform, let's call them courtly amusements for the shogun. We're talking dances, skits, even piggyback races. Yes, really. Imagine a starch-collared merchant from Rotterdam galloping awkwardly in front of a warlord who's trying not to laugh. You nearly snort tea watching it unfold. Historians still argue whether Japan's Dutch connection truly influenced its future modernization, or whether it was more symbolic, a venting valve during centuries of closure. Either way, you can see that even a trickle of contact has power. Dutch books on science, anatomy, and geography quietly slip into the hands of Japanese scholars, who copy them, debate them, and translate them with obsessive precision. Rangaku, or Dutch learning, becomes a lifeline for a curious island, trying to peek at a changing world without being pulled into it. Meanwhile, back on Dejima, the atmosphere is controlled. Guards patrol the single bridge to mainland Nagasaki. Anyone who wants to communicate across that divide must pass through layers of formality. paperwork, and sometimes convenient silence. You overhear whispered conversations between Japanese officials and Dutch agents about Korean tensions, European wars, and the rising taste for coffee over tea. It's like espionage, but with more calligraphy. The traders miss home. You see it in their careful rituals. Dutch cheese shipped halfway around the world, the hoarded bottles of gin, the scratchy records of letters never sent. One merchant shows you a sketch of tulips drawn from memory. "We used to risk everything for these," he says with a half smile. "Now I'd risk it all for decent weather." They don't stay long. VOC policy rotates them out frequently to avoid over-familiarity. You wonder if the real fear isn't romance or religion, but empathy. If you stay too long, it's harder to pretend the people across the bridge are merely a market. And yet there's warmth here. A shared joke over a mispronounced word. Gift of candied citrus passed with two hands. You watch a young Japanese scholar sneak peeks at a Dutch astronomy chart, face glowing in the lamplight. His notebook is already full. The empire deals in goods, but the future, you suspect, is being smuggled in on ink and wonder. Back on the docks, the ship is ready to sail. Porcelain packed like Fabergé eggs, orders sealed. The cargo hold smells of sea salt, pine tar, and mild anxiety. You hear rumors. Another shogun, stricter than the last. A new edict. Tensions rising. The Dutch might lose their foothold at any moment, and yet they persist. Because even the thinnest thread, spun carefully, can bind two worlds. The sun sets over Dejima, casting long shadows through the bamboo blinds. You stand between cultures, languages, and centuries, and realize how strange it is that sometimes the quietest outposts make the loudest echoes. And then, a final absurd moment. A samurai and a Dutch clerk try to share a joke. It doesn't quite translate, but they both laugh anyway. Maybe that's enough. You blink in the candlelight, sitting in a cramped room in Amsterdam that smells like ink, oil lamps, and maybe heresy. This is no lavish salon, just a modest space cluttered with books, scrolls, and one very tired man polishing his eyeglasses. His name? Baruch Spinoza. He greets you with a nod but doesn't stop scribbling. Welcome to the part of the Dutch golden age they don't paint in oils, the part built on dangerous ideas. Outside, Amsterdam bustles with trade and chatter, canals, winding through neighborhoods stacked with brick houses and fortune. Tolerance is the word of the day, printed proudly on city banners and whispered in business deals. You're allowed to believe, mostly, whatever you want. Catholics, Jews, Protestants of every flavor, they're all here, living in cautious harmony. But you quickly learn there's a difference between being tolerated and being welcomed. That's the line Spinoza walks, barefoot probably, and deep in thought. Born into a Portuguese Jewish family that fled the Inquisition, he becomes one of the most quietly radical minds of the century. His philosophy? God isn't a bearded man in the sky, it's everything. Nature, the universe, existence itself. Oh, and free will might be an illusion. Also, miracles are natural phenomena we don't yet understand. Needless to say, this does not go over well with religious authorities. You sit beside him as he carves letters into glass lenses to pay rent. The man is excommunicated by his own synagogue, shunned by the city's Jewish community, and watched carefully by the Dutch government. Yet somehow no one quite manages to silence him. That's Amsterdam for you. Half empire, half paradox. And it's not just Spinoza. The city hums with thinkers pushing boundaries. Descartes passed through, and so did John Locke. Publishers in back alleys print works banned in Spain, France, even England. If a book is too hot to handle elsewhere, chances are good it'll find paper and ink here. Still, tolerance has limits. You pass a tavern where pamphlets mock the Reformed Church, only to see the printer arrested days later. Freedom. Here often means knowing how much truth you can tell before someone notices. The Dutch didn't invent cancel culture, but they were certainly early adopters. Quirky fact? Spinoza turned down a prestigious university post because it would have required him to stop publishing his real thoughts. He preferred freedom and grinding lenses over a salary and a muzzle. That's commitment, or stubbornness, or both. You walk the alleys at night, hearing debates spill from windows. About predestination, about the nature of good, about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Okay, maybe not that one. The conversations are heated, passionate, and sometimes whispered. Ideas here are traded like spices, valued, coveted, occasionally lethal. Historians still argue whether the Dutch Republic was truly tolerant or just commercially pragmatic. Did they allow religious freedom because it was right, or because it was profitable? After all, a city full of smart, persecuted immigrants is also a city full of hard-working, networked survivors. And nothing oils the gears of capitalism like refugees with ambition. You visit the Athenaeum Illustre, a kind of proto-university where students read Latin texts by candlelight and argue about Aristotle. You sneak into a lecture on natural law and watch two boys nearly come to blows over a footnote. The professor smiles faintly. It's all part of the process. Then there's the surveillance. Letters opened, attics searched, informants paid in coin or favors. Tolerance, yes, but with eyes everywhere. Spinoza keeps a packed suitcase in the corner just in case. You notice it's dusty, though. He's betting the Dutch won't bother. Him? Not fully. He's not exactly wrong. And yet the walls whisper. The Jewish quarter keeps its secrets. The Catholic churches hide behind unmarked doors, all incense and shadows. No crosses on the exterior, no bells. Just silence. And the hum of prayer. The Republic tolerates but does not endorse. The message is clear. Believe what you want as long as you don't make it weird. Still, the ideas born here spread. Across Europe, thinkers read Dutch texts and whisper Spinoza's name like it's a spell. God is nature, they repeat, stunned and maybe a little thrilled. The Bible is metaphor. Freedom is thinking clearly. You watch those words leap borders, spark arguments, change lives. You look at Spinoza again. He's still writing, still frowning at a half-formed sentence. His pen scratches across parchment as if chasing the world's edge. He doesn't speak to you much, just gestures toward a window. Outside, the city glows amber in the fading sun. Boats drift by. The bells ring. You feel it then. That strange friction at the heart of this golden age. Commerce and conscience. Freedom and fear. The Dutch built an empire, yes, but also a library. A whisper network of thought. A system that, however flawed, lets some light in. You leave the philosopher in peace and walk into the night. The air is thick with smoke and sermon, salt and ink. Somewhere a printer sets a banned manuscript into type. Somewhere a spy makes a quiet note. And somewhere someone dares to ask a question out loud. You step into a boardroom that smells faintly of wax, ink, and ambition. The air is stale, but sharp, like dried nutmeg crushed underfoot. A dozen men in heavy robes and stiff, white collars are seated around a long table. Their wigs immaculate, their expressions inscrutable. This is no palace, no war council, no monastery. This is power, Dutch style. Welcome to the Heren 17. These are the Lord 17, the high command of the Dutch East India Company. Not kings, not emperors, but somehow more dangerous. Because, unlike royalty, these men don't pretend to rule by divine right. They rule by dividend. You stand quietly in the corner watching as ledgers are opened and decisions made. The mood is clinical, detached, like a dissection, except the body on the table is half the known world. One man speaks about increasing spice yields in Ambon. Another suggests replacing a troublesome local ruler in Ceylon. Someone quietly notes a ship lost near the Cape, cargo unrecoverable. A pause, a shrug, and they move on. The empire is a spreadsheet and every rebellion is just a budget adjustment. The Heren 16 were appointed by the various chambers of the VOC, Amsterdam, Zeeland, Delft, and others. But make no mistake, Amsterdam holds the real sway. 9 of the 17 seats are theirs. The rest? Tokens. The illusion of balance. You realize quickly that while the VOC is technically a company, it acts very much like a state. It coins its own money, signs treaties, wages war. And these men? They're the unelected cabinet of the world's first multinational megacorporation. One of them is tapping his fingers on a map. Batavia to Nagasaki, Makassar to Malacca. The routes aren't just lines, they're arteries. The VOC's heart pumps profit, and these trade winds are its bloodstream. Ships leave every week, hulking, mathematically packed, weaponized with both cannons and contracts. As you listen, the topics flow like a market ticker. Nutmeg prices falling due to oversupply, a fortification needing repair in Banda, too many. Deaths among enslaved laborers in Suriname, causing, above all, a dip in output. You wait for someone to mention ethics, morality, humanity. They never do. One gentleman reads aloud from a report on a local uprising in the Moluccas. Casualties, negligible. Order restored. You know, because you've seen it yourself, that negligible meant entire villages. You want to speak to interrupt, but this isn't your world. Here, language is its own weapon. Euphemism rules the day. Blood is always just spill over. Lives are losses. And when someone suggests increasing bribes to certain sultans, the word used is diplomatic lubrication. You make a mental note to wash your ears. Still, there's a strange genius in the system. The VOC built a bureaucratic empire so efficient, it functioned on autopilot. Decisions in this room ripple across oceans. An agreement made over wine in Amsterdam might lead to a war in Sri Lanka, or a famine in Java, or a new garden of tulips blooming beside a canal, paid for in cinnamon. Not that the board sees it that way. They see stability, growth. They see bar graphs and long-term strategy. One even chuckles as he remarks, "The Portuguese built churches, we build contracts." It's not just a flex, it's a world view. In Dutch imperialism, sanctity lies not in altars or bloodlines, but in quarterly returns. One curious detail catches your eye. On a nearby table sits a plate of stroopwafels and a single Japanese teacup, cracked but still in use. It once belonged to a shogun's interpreter, passed to the company as part of a diplomatic gift. A quirky detail, perhaps, but it fits. The VOC didn't just conquer lands, it collected symbols. Every spice crate, every artifact, every story, curated, commodified, cataloged. Behind the scenes, clerks scurry in and out, carting charts, budgets, and shipping manifests. They speak quickly, almost in code, and you begin to realize that even the paper here holds power. The Dutch perfected double-entry bookkeeping centuries before QuickBooks existed. Here, accounts balance not in favor of the just, but the profitable. Still, not everything is smooth. One member grumbles about rising costs of European crewmen, another about local unrest. Someone dares to question whether certain monopolies are sustainable. Eyes narrow. The room cools a degree. It's not treason, but it's not welcome either. You notice something else. The art. The room is lined with portraits of past company directors, their gazes flat and austere. No one smiles. It's as if the canvas itself understands this empire was built not on joy but on margins. There's a map beside them too, an old one, pre-VOC, where sea monsters still roamed the waves. Someone scrawled updates on it in the margins. Control established. Region secured. Trade route formalized. As if all of history could be rewritten with ink and authority. And yet, the Heeren Sikventiend are not untouchable. Whispers of corruption, mismanagement, and backroom deals swirl like smoke around their powdered wigs. Some directors are here because of skill, others because of family or favors. Historians still argue whether the VOC's decline started from external competition or internal rot, but this room certainly contains a bit of both. As the meeting winds down, you see hands reach for snuff boxes, quills dipped for signatures, and murmured agreements exchanged like secrets in a confessional. The Dutch Empire was never ruled by swords alone. It was ruled by minutes, contracts, quiet nods in paneled rooms. You leave the boardroom quietly, stepping out into the canals of Amsterdam. The air is crisp, The city serene. Children play by the water. No one sees the power that just shifted behind those oak doors. But you do. You felt it, and it chills you more than any battlefield ever could. You stand before a tall, silent doorway. Heavy wood weathered by time, a lion carved in its arch. The scent of nutmeg hangs faintly in the breeze, sweet and spicy, almost comforting, almost deceitful. This is Ambon, one of the Spice Islands, and the breeze you feel isn't just tropical, it's political. It's the kind of wind that carries whispers of rebellion, soaked in the blood of betrayal and blooming in the cracks of empire. You glance around. The foliage is thick, green, and vibrant, almost defiant in its lushness. But behind the leaves, the tension simmers. You remember the VOC, our good old friends, the Dutch East India Company. Back in the early 1600s, they rolled in with big ships, bigger egos, and an even bigger appetite for spice profits. At first it was handshakes and trading beads, then contracts and cannonballs. The Banda Islands had already tasted what happened when locals refused Dutch monopoly. Now Ambon, Ternate, Tidore, and other Moluccan islands try to navigate this boiling pot of alliances, expectations, and occasional backstabbing. Today you're following the scent trail of nutmeg and cloves, but you're also tracing something less tangible, the quiet rumblings of a people unwilling to stay quiet. You feel it first in the markets. Women in patterned sarongs sell cloves in tight bundles, speaking in whispers. The VOC fort looms nearby, its walls thick with a confidence only gunpowder grants. The soldiers there drink watered-down wine and play dice, but even they throw glances over their shoulders. Remember the Huron 17th? The bigwigs back in Amsterdam with their ledger books and moral flexibility? Well, they've sent strict instructions. Maintain control at all costs. The monopoly must hold. But the problem is, spice doesn't grow. Well, in fear. And people, especially proud native islanders with centuries of trade behind them, don't enjoy being told who they can and can't sell to. Imagine someone telling you your lemons can only be sold to your least favorite cousin, and for pennies. You'd revolt too. So here comes the uprising, not in a single explosion but as a long, slow boil. In 1650s Ambon, rumblings take root. Sultans who once tolerated Dutch demands begin forging alliances. Secret letters sail between islands faster than VOC couriers. There's a whisper campaign, subtle at first, refusing to harvest on Dutch time. Suddenly, entire groves go missing. Some farmers mysteriously forget which trees produce the most valuable crops. Tiny acts of rebellion that smell quite literally of resistance. You trail behind a merchant as he slips into the jungle. He knows the Dutch patrols don't wander this deep. Beneath tangled canopies, he meets a rival trader from Makassar. Yes, a banned competitor. They speak quietly in a dialect you can't quite parse, but the exchange is clear. Spice for silver. Illicit trade, baby. One of the VOC's greatest fears. You duck behind a tree. There's tension in the air and not the usual humid kind. You realize just how fragile Dutch control really is. The VOC tried to keep order with alliances to local rulers, especially the Sultan of Ternate, a key Dutch ally. But as resistance grew, those same alliances turned slippery. It didn't help that the Dutch often played both sides, promising protection while undermining independence. Historians still argue whether the local leaders ever truly trusted the VOC or just used them as temporary leverage. But what's clear? The Dutch underestimated the complexity of island loyalties. They came expecting chess. They got 4D political mahjong. One evening, you're near Fort Victoria, eavesdropping as a Dutch captain berates a local interpreter. "Where's the shipment? Why haven't the sultans responded?" The interpreter shrugs. "Storms," he says in sickness, but you see his eyes flicker. He knows more. Everyone does. A coordinated resistance is bubbling and VOC ships can't be everywhere at once. Then a sudden change. A village refuses a quota. A Dutch outpost finds its stores looted. Cloves gone. Not long after, there's a coordinated torching of spice. Groves. Entire plantations burned to ash. Self-sabotage? You bet. Better to lose the harvest than let it fatten foreign pockets. Retaliation comes fast and brutal. Dutch soldiers march into villages, accuse chiefs, hang suspected traitors. You watch from a distance, the air thick with smoke and something worse, resentment that doesn't die with fire. But this time resistance spreads further. The Ambonese are no longer scattered farmers, they're an informed, interconnected community. Word of Viok brutality travels across islands. By the time it reaches Ternate, the Sultan's court is already reconsidering its alliances. A young noble, barely 20, gives a speech to his elders, eyes blazing, voice steady. The Dutch buy with silver but pay in chains, he says. You notice the way heads nod, slowly at first, then all at once. You feel the tremor underfoot. It's not an earthquake, it's conviction. Back in the fort, the Dutch scramble. Reinforcements are delayed. Ships are stuck in monsoon season. Officials in Batavia write frustrated letters. The tone is shifting, from condescending to worried. The empire is stretched, and here, on these tiny islands, its seams are fraying. And yet, in true VOC fashion, their solution is more control, crackdowns, more surveillance, more executions, but here's the kicker. The more they try to tighten their grip, the more resistance slips through their fingers. The nutmeg is gone, sure, but so is the illusion of control. One day, you sit on a hillside with an old farmer. He speaks softly as he fingers the dark soil. They think we fear them, he says, but we only fear forgetting who we are. His words stay with you, because you realize that's the true revolution, not just the torches and skirmishes, but the refusal to let empire erase identity. By the end of the decade, Ambon has become a blueprint, both for Dutch overreach and for the limits of domination by decree. The VOC holds on, but just barely. The spice keeps flowing, but never again without resistance humming in the background. And you? You walk back to the harbor. The breeze cooler now. The scent of cloves still lingers. But there's something else on the wind too. Defiance. Wrapped in bark and fire. You duck as a cannonball whistles overhead, lazily, almost politely, before splashing harmlessly into the sea. Around you, chaos waltzes across the waves. Sails flap in panic, smoke curls from blackened hulls, and men shout in a dozen different languages. You're in the middle of a naval battle, but oddly, no one's particularly upset. Welcome to the world of pirates and privateers, where theft is a job, flags are optional, and moral high ground is mostly just whichever ship happens to be upwind. The Dutch, for all their banking and bookkeeping, were no strangers to piracy. They just preferred to invoice it. During the Golden Age, privateers were the corporate cousins of pirates, legally sanctioned sea robbers with contracts in one hand and cutlasses in the other. The VOC and WIC, West India Company, both employed these entrepreneurial corsairs to harass enemy ships, seize cargo, and occasionally liberate entire ports. War, after all, is expensive. Why not outsource the looting? You lean over the railing of a Dutch Floyd, a sleek merchant ship that, thanks to a few modifications, now doubles as a gunboat. Below deck, barrels of gunpowder sit next to casks of pickled herring. Upstairs, a captain with a stained cravat sharpens his sword, while humming a sea shanty about an English convoy he plans to ambush. He winks at you. Nothing personal, he says, just the market. The Dutch weren't the only ones playing this dangerous game. The English and French had their own fleets of semi-legal raiders. But the Dutch? They industrialized it. Their merchants wrote letters of marque, basically pirate permission slips, and tallied stolen cargo like quarterly dividends. Historians still argue whether the VOC's reliance on privateering helped extend its dominance or merely sowed the seeds of chaotic maritime anarchy. Probably both. But either way, the line between businessman and buccaneer was drawn in seafoam. Out in the Caribbean, things got particularly spicy. The Dutch WIC waged open warfare against Spanish treasure fleets, raiding ports from Cuba to Panama with a mix of swagger and spreadsheets. You stand in a quiet lagoon off Curacao as a sloop glides in, its deck low with gold and gilt. The crew? Mostly freelancers. Dutch, Portuguese Jews, Afro-Caribbeans, and a few disgruntled Englishmen. A floating HR nightmare, really. One of them offers you a sip of something sharp and fermented from a stolen Spanish barrel. "It's not piracy," he says, teeth gleaming, if the other guy's a Catholic. You notice something peculiar. These Dutch privateers weren't always loyal to the Netherlands. If a French governor offered better pay, they'd swap flags mid-voyage. Identity on the high seas was fluid, literally. A Dutch sailor one month might be robbing Dutch merchants the next. The sea, it turns out, is a terrible place for nationalism. The VOC pretended to be above it all, officially anti-pirate, of course, but in truth, they danced a careful tango. They needed the chaos. Pirates disrupted rivals, destabilized trade routes, and kept local rulers too nervous to organize serious resistance. If a Dutch ship happened to recover a load of nutmeg that had been rescued from a Portuguese vessel, well, accidents happen. You sail now toward Madagascar, past a rocky outcrop known to harbor one of the most infamous pirate havens of the 17th century. Here, in a cluster of ramshackle huts and shipwrecks, outlaws drank, plotted, and occasionally married local women. The Dutch tried to police this stretch of ocean, but how do you patrol an entire planet with ships that max out at 9 knots and a tendency to sink? Even the legendary Dutch Admiral Michiel de Ruyter, one of the few commanders both feared and beloved, had to reckon with the pirate problem. On one voyage, he captured several vessels flying no national flag. Suspicious, his logbook reads, "That's 1600s Dutch for definitely pirates." Sometimes the lines blurred hilariously. In one case, a Dutch governor arrested a pirate captain, held him overnight, then released him after a small fine and a promise to only rob the English for a while. You know, strategic civility. Of course, not all privateering was cheeky. Some raids ended in massacres. Entire port towns were burned and merchants slaughtered. One infamous Dutch raid on Bahia in Brazil sent shockwaves through Portuguese trade. You walk the beach there, noticing scorched church walls and rusted cannonballs half buried in the sand. The locals remember, not just the violence, but the eerie politeness of the Dutch officers who supervised the looting with a clipboard in hand. Back in Europe, Amsterdam's taverns buzzed with stories. "My cousin took a French prize off Barbados," one sailor brags. "They were carrying sugar, silver, and a live parrot that now drinks rum." The Dutch public saw these stories not as crimes, but as proof of their nation's cunning. Theft was, after all, more acceptable when it funded canals and Rembrandts. But piracy cut both ways. Dutch ships were just as likely to be ambushed, and the VOC lost millions in stolen cargo over the decades. Insurance brokers in Amsterdam scrambled to assess risk. Rates went up. Fortresses got thicker. Cannons got bigger. But the pirates kept coming because trade routes once carved are hard to erase. You can't invent global capitalism without inventing global crime. As you walk along the docks in Zealand, a merchant quietly slips you a list. It's coded, but you recognize the names. Captains for hire, their fees, their loyalties. These aren't rebels. They're businessmen, entrepreneurs. In a way, they're the purest version of the Dutch Golden Age. Ambitious, ruthless, and willing to bend any rule if the returns are high enough. By the end of the century, the golden sheen has dulled. Piracy becomes harder to control. A generation of seafarers raised on plunder now lacks wars to justify it. With peace comes awkward questions. Should we try diplomacy? The Dutch Navy tightens control. The VOC drafts stricter codes. But by then, the damage is done. The sea has tasted freedom, and it isn't giving it back. You stand at the edge of a pier, watching the sun set over a quiet bay. Somewhere out there, a black sail moves silently. A flag unfurls. Maybe Dutch, maybe not. The breeze carries the scent of salt, gunpowder, and unresolved history. You plant your boots on soft, damp soil and gaze up at a rocky outcrop, overgrown with weeds and thyme. There are no skyscrapers here, no honking cabs or neon signs, just a small wind-whipped patch of land at the southern tip of a skinny island. But don't get too comfortable. You're standing on what will one day be the most expensive real estate in the world. For now, though, it's just New Amsterdam. Barely a splinter of an outpost, half swamp, half gamble. It begins with a purchase that's become legend, though the details remain forever fuzzy. Historians still argue whether the Dutch really bought Manhattan from the Lenape people for about 60 guilders in trade goods, often said to be around $24 in modern money. But of course, the very idea of selling land was foreign to the Lenape, who likely saw it more as a gesture of shared access than a permanent deed. You crouch beside the East River and try not to think about how many condos now rest on that misunderstanding. Still, from the Dutch perspective, it was a steal. They wanted a northern foothold for the West India Company, something to rival the Spanish colonies and maybe catch a piece of the fur trade. So they built Fort Amsterdam and called the whole colony New Netherland, with New Amsterdam as its capital. It sounds ambitious. It looked more like a rustic Lego set. You walk the single main street, literally called Breedaweg or Broadway. Wooden houses lean uncertainly to one side. Chickens dart between barrels. A bored-looking sentry in a moth-eaten uniform scratches his neck and eyes you with mild suspicion. It's not exactly a metropolis, but give it time. The Dutch governance style here: casual, bordering on chaotic. The WIC appointed directors who were supposed to oversee the colony, but most of them were underqualified, overwhelmed, or just uninterested. One early director, Peter Minuit, oversaw that infamous land purchase. Another, Willem Kieft, launched a brutal war against local native tribes without permission, consultation, or even a plan. It went as well as you'd expect. Buildings burned, settlers fled. Relations with the Lenape crumbled like overbaked stroopwafels. You sip something vaguely alcoholic in a smoky tavern by the docks, listening to the locals grumble about Kieft. He taxes us, one growls, but can't defend us. Another chimes in. He builds a wall, literally a wall, to keep out the natives. And guess who has to pay for it? You glance west, where that wall will someday become Wall Street. Turns out even financial districts begin with fear and fences. And then comes Peter Stuyvesant. Ah yes, peg-legged, puffed up, perpetually angry. The last Dutch director of New Netherland arrives in 1647 with a wooden leg and a whole cannon's worth of attitude. He's determined to impose order. Dutch reformed churches, strict moral laws, and bans on everything from drunkenness to open market sex work. Naturally, he becomes about as popular as a rainstorm during a harvest, but you have to give him credit. He holds the colony together. Stuyvesant builds schools, cracks down on smuggling, and even expands the settlement. You stroll through orchards, planted under his rule, and past buildings that, centuries later, will still bear faint traces of Dutch architecture. Brick gables, thick doors, high stoops. And though the Dutch were no angels, New Amsterdam under Stuyvesant was oddly tolerant. By 1650, the population included free black residents, Sephardic Jews from Brazil, Walloons, Germans, and yes, even a few Englishmen. Not that they all got along. You attend a town meeting where a farmer, a merchant, and a rabbi argue over sheep grazing rights, Sabbath laws, and whether a distillery should be allowed next to the school. It's chaotic, multilingual, and kind of beautiful. For all their rigidity back home, the Dutch in New Netherland are discovering something new: pluralism, tolerance not as ideology, but as a survival skill. Still, tensions simmer. The English have their eyes on the colony, and by the 1660s, they're stronger, richer, and frankly more aggressive. One morning, you see sails on the horizon. English, warships, no declaration, no negotiation, just a polite demand for surrender. Stuyvesant wants to fight. The townspeople? Not so much. They're tired, they're outgunned, and they know that with a bit of tweaking, they can keep doing business under new management. So the Dutch hand over New Amsterdam in 1664, and just like that, it becomes New York. No battle, no fire, just a quiet name change and a slow burning legacy. You walk the newly dubbed Duke of York Street, still broad, still muddy, and feel the shift. Dutch buildings remain, Dutch families stay, even Dutch customs linger, cookies, stoops, and that stubborn habit of not saying hello unless absolutely necessary. Later, you sit on a bench overlooking the harbor, watching the sunset paint the skyline in amber. You remember the gamble it all was, the scrappy outpost, the mismanaged colony, the tense peace with the Lenape, the arrogant governors. And yet somehow, it grew, from a swampy investment to the seed of a global capital. A merchant walks past, tipping his hat. "You know," he says, "we may have lost the colony, but we set the tone." And he's right. New York inherits that Dutch blend of profit, pluralism, and controlled chaos. Even centuries later, the rhythm of the place still echoes those first wooden planks and stubborn settlers. And somewhere beneath the concrete, under layers of history, old New Amsterdam still breathes. You step off the gangplank and feel it immediately. The air is heavy like molasses, and so is the silence. No seagulls here, no market cries, just the low hum of labor. You're in the Dutch colony of Suriname now, and every breath tastes faintly of sugar and sweat. The fields stretch to the horizon, rows of cane taller than you, their leaves whispering with every shift of wind. This is where the Dutch perfected a different kind of empire, one less about spice and more about systems. Specifically, the system of enslaved labor. The plantations are everywhere, some grand with pillared houses and shaded verandas, others little more than brutal factories carved into the jungle. You wander through one now, watching teams of people work in grueling synchrony, cutting, hauling, boiling. The process is almost mechanical, but the people, anything but. They are from West Africa, taken, transported, renamed. Their histories are scraped away, replaced with Dutch plantation ledgers and cruelly anglicized tags. Field hand number 47 doesn't begin to capture the woman slicing cane with calloused fingers and eyes that miss nothing. Dutch merchants back in Amsterdam sip tea and marvel at the profits. Sugar, molasses, rum. It all flows like gold through Europe's ports. The labor behind it, mostly invisible to them, and maybe that's the point. You pass by a scribe tallying production figures in a leather-bound journal, and he doesn't even look up. Numbers, not names. Slavery wasn't just present in the Dutch Empire. It was engineered. The Dutch West India Company operated slave forts in West Africa, shipped people across the Atlantic, and sold them like goods in the Caribbean and Brazil. Some scholars estimate that the Dutch were responsible for transporting over 500,000 enslaved people during their imperial run. Historians still argue whether the VOC's involvement was strategic or opportunistic, but either way, the outcome was the same. Lives uprooted, generations fractured, and an economy that thrived on subjugation. You stand in the hold of a Dutch slaver ship for a moment too long. It smells of old wood, salt, and something much harder to name. Shackles lie rusted in the corner, and above, the creak of the hull sounds oddly like breathing. This is not a place made for memory. And yet, here it lingers. You meet one man, a Maroon escaped decades ago, now living deep in the rainforest. He tells you in hushed tones about the communities formed by fugitives, hidden enclaves where African languages, stories, and resistance strategies were preserved. These Maroons weren't just survivors. They were warriors, organizers, spiritual leaders. Some raided plantations, others forged uneasy truces. All carved out space in a world designed to erase them. The Dutch response? Brutality, then bureaucracy. They built forts and negotiated treaties with Maroon leaders while also deploying soldiers to hunt them. One official even suggested rewarding plantation owners who recaptured runaways by giving them tax breaks. Encouraging loyalty, he called it. You shake your head. Encouraging cruelty, more like. Back in the fields, the pace is unrelenting. Overseers, some Dutch, others local collaborators, ride past on horseback barking orders. The punishment for slow work is public and swift. Lashes, isolation, even branding. You flinch when you see a child no older than 8 balancing a bundle of cane twice his size. The work does not stop for the young, the sick, or the grieving, and yet somehow, joy exists here too. Quiet, defiant joy. A lullaby sung at dusk. A shared joke whispered behind barrels. A dance performed barefoot beneath a full moon, each step a soft rebellion. You hear rhythms that defy Dutch order, drums, chants, patterns too old to be forgotten. The enslaved people here carry not just pain but culture. The empire may hold their bodies but not their stories. One local legend tells of a woman who, rather than be taken back to the fields, flew into the sky with her children. Back to Africa, back to freedom. The Dutch scoffed at these tales. But you, standing in the shadows of a sugar mill, understand the need for wings. The Dutch weren't alone in this horror, of course. The French, the English, the Portuguese, all trafficked in human lives. But the Dutch, ever efficient, built a system that maximized profit with chilling precision. They kept excellent records. They created insurance policies for slave ships. Some Dutch investors bought shares in multiple plantations, never setting foot on the soil. They simply watched the returns roll in, sipping Genever by candlelight. You peek into one of those account books. Damage, 3 oxen, 17 slaves. Just like that. No names, no context. The ledger closes with a snap. Even when slavery was technically phased out, the Dutch system found ways to perpetuate it. Indentured labor replaced chattel slavery, but the structure remained rigid, racial, and ruthlessly extractive. People were still trapped in cycles of debt and dependency, still working lands they would never own. The empire adapted, but it never apologized. Now, centuries later, Suriname carries echoes. You walk through Paramaribo and see Dutch buildings leaning over Afro-Surinamese music shops and Javanese warung stalls. The mix is vibrant, but the past is just under the surface. Locals speak of ancestors who survived both chains and silence. In 2020, the Dutch king made a speech acknowledging slavery's legacy, but many argue it was too little, too late. Back in Amsterdam, one of those Grand Canal mansions bears a plaque now, built with profits from Suriname. You trace the carved letters with your finger, wondering who chose to finally tell that truth. As the sun sets over the fields, the cane rustles like a whisper. You close your eyes and imagine the hands that once worked this land, the lives taken, the songs saved. You can almost hear the rhythm of that forgotten dance, steady as a heartbeat. You crouch low under the curved wooden eaves of a tiny island, dock, your breath fogging slightly in the cool, misty air. No spice in the breeze here, no jungle thrum, only silence, disciplined and deliberate. You're on Dejima, a man-made sliver of land in Nagasaki Bay, shaped like a fan, and perhaps the most isolated, surveilled patch of real estate in the entire Dutch Empire. Japan, it turns out, has had enough of foreign interference. Portuguese missionaries stirred unrest, Catholicism spread too fast for comfort, and Western traders brought more than silver. They brought disruption. So the Tokugawa shogunate pulled the shutters closed in the 1630s, expelling most Europeans, and forbidding Japanese subjects from leaving the country under penalty of death. Japan became a locked house. All the windows were shuttered, except one. That window was Dutch-shaped. Why them? Historians still argue whether it was pragmatism, distrust, or sheer luck. Maybe all three. The Dutch, unlike the Portuguese and Spanish, didn't proselytize. They weren't interested in converting souls, just selling things. That made them useful and, more importantly, containable. The Japanese allowed a small Dutch presence to continue, under strict conditions. No women, no religious materials, and absolutely no wandering beyond Dejima. If the Dutch wanted to stay, they'd live like well-mannered prisoners. So here you are, confined to this tiny artificial island, just 200 meters long. It's technically a trading post, but it feels more like a stage set for a bizarre diplomatic play. You walk past warehouses full of copper, lacquerware, and porcelain, Japan's exports, and cases of silk, sugar, and yes, the occasional crate of clocks or telescopes coming in from the west. Every crate is checked, every letter inspected. The Japanese interpreters take their jobs very seriously, and you notice they speak Dutch with a crisp precision that could rival The Hague. Inside the Dutch quarters, life is tightly scheduled. Meals, paperwork, trade ledgers, reports for Batavia, all must continue, even as the outside world remains out of reach. You flip through a medical journal one bored trader is writing, and another notebook full of sketches of beetles. A fringe perk of Dejima, science. The Japanese are fascinated by Western medicine, astronomy, even anatomy. Dutch doctors trade knowledge with Japanese scholars, creating a strange but fertile intellectual bridge. This rangaku, or Dutch learning, will outlive the VOC itself. But don't romanticize it too much. This is still an arm of empire. The Dutch aren't here as guests. They're tolerated because they're useful. Each year the Dutch chief, or Opperhoofd, must make an elaborate trek to Edo, modern-day Tokyo, to pay tribute to the shogun. It's part political theater, part humiliation ritual. You tag along, watching as the Opperhoofd bows low, presents exotic gifts, and tiptoes around topics like trade quotas and copper weights. The Japanese smile politely, nod, and decide what scraps of the outside world they'll allow in. It's a masterclass in controlled access. You overhear whispers of secret dealings, slipped letters, off-the-record exchanges, occasional smuggled items. But Dejima is too small for true subterfuge. Every movement is logged. Every shadow has a scribe. And yet Dejima thrives in its weird way. The Dutch are isolated, yes, but they're also a singular conduit of knowledge. Through them, Japan learns about Newton, Galen, Leeuwenhoek's microbes. And in return, the Dutch get porcelain so fine it hums when tapped, silk dyed with impossible precision, and a window, however narrow, into a world otherwise vanished to Europeans. At night, you sit at the edge of the island, toes almost touching, the water, listening to the distant thrum of Nagasaki. You wonder about the Japanese artisans and samurai across the bridge. What do they think of the strange pale men with their heavy boots and elaborate facial hair? You'll never really know. Interaction is strictly limited. Some traders go their entire careers without seeing more than one Japanese city. But knowledge still seeps through like water through a woven mat. One Japanese scholar shows you his prized possession, a Dutch anatomy book, lovingly translated, its margins filled with meticulous notes in both languages. Another shows off a lens ground to Dutch specifications. These are small revolutions, scalpels, of science carving open the sealed body of Japan. There are ironies here too. You think about how back in Suriname, Dutch efficiency turned people into property. Here in Japan, the same empire wears gloves. It submits to rules, behaves. In one colony, the Dutch wield power without restraint. In another, they are carefully leashed. The empire adapts, shapeshifts. Sometimes it conquers with cannon fire. Sometimes with curiosity and catalogs. The VOC never truly dominates Japan, not militarily, not culturally. But it persists, and in that persistence lies power. While other nations lose their toeholds, the Dutch hold fast. They create a centuries-long presence that weaves into Japanese history in subtle, persistent threads. Eventually, you rise from your quiet post by the water and walk back toward the dormitory. The air smells of rice and salt and seaweed. Somewhere behind the walls, a Japanese official logs your movements in a leather-bound notebook, ticking off your curfew. The bridge that connects Dejima to the mainland is guarded, of course. But still, there's something poetic about it. The tiniest possible connection, a sliver of cultural exchange carefully regulated and wholly unintended. And yet, out of this tiny island, great ideas flow. That's empire, too. Not just guns and gold, but footnotes and friction and forced coexistence. Before bed, you write a single line in your own notebook. Sometimes, the strongest walls still let in the light. You step onto soil that glows green, with promise. Rich, humid, fertile. The kind of land that drinks sunshine like sugar. Welcome to Brazil. Or rather, Dutch Brazil, a temporary patch in South America where the VOC once gambled big. Not many remember this chapter, and maybe that's because unlike New Amsterdam or Batavia, it didn't quite stick. But for a moment, the Dutch tried to plant their empire in the tropics, and they did it with sugar, steel, and slavery. You squint into the sun as sugarcane rustles high above your head, blades whispering like gossip. This is the northeast of Brazil, a stretch of coastline with names like Recife and Olinda, Portuguese towns to be sure, but briefly under Dutch rule in the 1600s. The VOC invaded in 1630, boots on beaches, hoping to muscle in on the lucrative sugar trade and sever Iberia's colonial grip. What followed was a strange, tropical interlude. Dutch forts rose beside Catholic cathedrals. Protestant governors ruled over Catholic locals. And the most curious of all, the painter-scientist Johann Maurits of Nassau ran the colony like it was part laboratory, part art studio, part economic engine. You hear his name murmured everywhere. Maurits, the Renaissance man in armor. Historians still argue whether Johann Maurits was a visionary reformer or just a more polished overseer of an extractive empire. Under his rule, canals were built, art flourished, and maps were drawn with exquisite detail. But don't let the watercolors fool you. This paradise came at a cost. You follow the crack of a whip, faint but unmistakable, to the sugar plantations. These aren't Dutch innovations, they're continuations. The Portuguese had already introduced the system and the Dutch simply adopted it wholesale, bringing in enslaved Africans by the thousands. The VOC, ever the pragmatic middleman, expanded the trade, linking West Africa to Brazil to the Netherlands in a loop of profit that was brutal and relentless. You pass by a senzala, a slave barracks, where men and women sleep in packed quarters, their hands raw from harvest, their eyes vacant. No painting ever captured this. You notice how quiet the place becomes as you approach, the way people freeze when Dutch boots echo on the path. This is the part of the golden age that glints less brightly, the human engine behind the sugar rush. It wasn't just labor that was transported, though. Culture flowed, too, in strange, backdoor ways. Capoeira, that haunting dance-fight hybrid, echoes faintly in the moonlight. A quiet act of rebellion passed between the enslaved. You sense rhythms that stretch from Africa to the Amazon, a cultural resilience that survives even the most calculating colonial order. Yet for all the VOC's ambition, Dutch Brazil never felt entirely stable. Constant attacks from Portuguese forces and resistance from local populations kept the region in turmoil. You overhear officers in Recife whispering nervously about guerrilla raids, about Catholic uprisings, about entire plantations going up in flames. The land never loved them back. And then there's the economics. At first, sugar pours into Amsterdam like white gold. Refineries sprout up, profits soar. But over time, the venture turns leaky. Military costs balloon. Forts need defending. And the enslaved, robbed of everything, rebel, quietly, cleverly, and sometimes spectacularly. You imagine one merchant back in the here and 17th boardroom raising an eyebrow at the latest Brazil ledger and asking, is it worth it? Even within Dutch ranks, there's friction. Johann Maurits is recalled in 1644, abruptly and without ceremony. His reforms, his dreams of a multi-ethnic, orderly Dutch Brazil, evaporate like morning dew. Some say he was too idealistic. Others say he wasn't profitable enough. In the VOC, that's all that really matters. By 1654, Dutch Brazil is gone, retaken by the Portuguese after a long, grinding fight. You watch as ships sail away, defeated but still carrying crates of sugar and barrels of Brazilian wood. The VOC shrugs, cuts its losses, and moves on to places more compliant. The failure is tucked into the folds of history like a receipt for a bad investment. Still, something lingers. When you walk the cobbled streets of Recife at dusk, you hear Dutch phrases woven into local dialects. You see Jewish synagogues, tolerated, here under Dutch rule, later shuttered under the Portuguese. You realize this short chapter left long fingerprints. The systems, the scars, they didn't vanish when the flags changed. Back in Amsterdam, no one mourns the loss too loudly. The company spins the story as a strategic retreat. Sugar continues to flow, just from different ports. The enslaved are traded elsewhere. The wheel keeps turning, and you, standing on the ghost of a plantation, realize this. Empire doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with fanfare and leaves with a shrug. But its impact, etched into soil, into bloodlines, into the names of streets and rivers, doesn't fade. As night falls, you step quietly away from the cane fields, your fingers brushing the sharp green blades. They hum a lullaby of pain and persistence, their roots deep in soil soaked by rain, sweat, and something unspoken. You sit on a cannon, warm from the sun and vibrating faintly with tension, though no battle has yet begun. Around you, the harbor, smells of brine, tar, and the unmistakable bite of burning coal. A Dutch flag flutters above, faded at the edges as if even the cloth knows this empire is tired. It's the late 1700s, and the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War is about to knock the wind from what remains of Dutch global dominance. You can feel it in the air. This isn't just a war over ports or trade. It's a reckoning. Your vantage point offers a perfect view of how far things have slipped. Once the Dutch Republic outpaced even Britain in maritime might. Now its ships are older, its crews underpaid, and its enemies, well, they're Britain and France, who've both been bulking up their colonial muscle while the Dutch were tangled in bureaucracy and counting tulip bulbs. You see a young Dutch sailor tying knots in a fraying rope. Metaphor meet reality. This war doesn't begin with a bang, but with a pile of paperwork. The Dutch had been trading quietly with the American revolutionaries, not officially, but enough to annoy Britain, who, let's be honest, never needs a huge excuse to pick a fight over tea, taxes, or treaties. The British issue an ultimatum. The Dutch shrug. That shrug cost them an empire. The cannon beneath you shifts slightly as it's repositioned. You glance toward the captain, who's reading a letter with lips pressed tight. Somewhere in that paper is news from Suriname, from Ceylon, from the Cape. It's bad. The British are taking colonies like they're collecting seashells. St. Eustatius, Demerara, Essequibo. A domino line of possessions topples with chilling ease. On the sea, the British Navy dominates. They have newer ships, better trained men, and a clarity of purpose. Cut the Dutch off from their empire. For the Dutch, the war effort is fragmented, underfunded, and slow. Even Amsterdam, once the brain of the trading web, is mired in political infighting. The old model of governance, the merchant-led States General, moves at the speed of molasses, hill. In January, as the Dutch prepare to defend their remaining assets, you realize something else. The war isn't just sapping their colonies, it's breaking their confidence. You overhear a whispered debate among two officers. Was the VOC still even worth defending? It had grown bloated, corrupt, and deeply in debt. Historians still argue whether the war accelerated its demise, or just exposed a corpse already too long embalmed in gold leaf. And that's the crux. The VOC, once the crown jewel of Dutch enterprise, is now a financial black hole. Its ships are barely seaworthy. Its governors bicker like tavern drunks. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War will in many ways be its death sentence. By 1799, the company will be formally dissolved, and the Dutch state will absorb its carcass like an awkward inheritance. But here's the quirky twist. One of the war's strangest moments involves a foggy harbor and a standoff without a single shot. In 1795, a Dutch fleet is frozen in at Den Helder. Literally, ice traps the ships. And the French cavalry, allies of the newly revolutionary Batavian Republic, do something utterly absurd. They capture the entire Dutch fleet on horseback. That's right. The only naval surrender in history, achieved by men on horses clomping over the ice like something out of a surreal military ballet. Somewhere, Neptune weeps with laughter. Back on your cannon, you watch smoke rise from the horizon. Another outpost gone, another ledger turned red. You think of the thousands of sailors now stranded, of the colonial administrators sipping bitter coffee in Batavia or Paramaribo, waiting for ships that will never come. You think of merchants in Amsterdam, staring at empty docks and wondering how they'll explain this to their investors or their wives. There's a creeping sense that this isn't just a war. It's an ending. Not a neat one, not a glorious one. An exhausted, bureaucratic unraveling. You remember that earlier war, the one where Dutch ships ruled the waves and painters turned victories into oil masterpieces. No one's painting this. At night you walk the docks and notice how quiet they are. The gulls have stopped crying. The water laps gently against piers that once bustled with cargo and shouting stevedores. Now, just echoes. And yet, in a tavern nearby, two drunk students argue passionately. One says the Republic will rise again. The other just burps and orders more gin. You're inclined to side with the burper. Because while wars have clear winners, and losers, empires often don't collapse with a bang. They sigh, they stall, they forget where they left their sword. The Dutch, by the end of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, have lost not only land and ships, but also their myth. And as the cannon beneath you finally cools, you realize what's coming next isn't rebirth. It's memory. The air in Batavia is thicker than it used to be. Not just from heat or monsoon haze, but from something harder to name. You walk through the city's crumbling heart, where whitewashed walls blister under a punishing sun, and the smell of stagnant canals replaces the once fresh aroma of cloves and nutmeg. The jewel of the Dutch East Indies, once a humming colonial nerve center, is starting to rot from within. You follow cracked cobblestones past a once grand warehouse, now listing slightly like a drunk too proud to fall over. Inside, rows of dusty crates sit untouched. They used to be packed with spices, silks, precious woods. Now mostly rotting coffee beans and dried-out dreams. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War has left scars here too, but deeper still is something older. The slow collapse of a system that stretched itself too far, for too long on too many backs. The VOC is dead now, officially dissolved in 1799. Its debts were so massive it made more sense for the Dutch government to absorb them than try to revive the company. You'd think people might have mourned its passing, like the fall of an old empire. But in Batavia, people mostly mutter and move on. Too many of them had suffered under the company's thumb to light any memorial candles. Still, the ghosts remain. You wander past Fort Batavia, its thick walls now chipped and scorched. Inside, soldiers play cards with the same bored expressions their grandfathers wore, just with fewer illusions. Disease still stalks the alleys. Malaria, dysentery, whatever the latest ship dragged in. European families send their children back to the Netherlands early now if they can afford it. The death rate here never truly drops, it just takes longer to notice. You hear a child crying in Dutch, but the street vendors shout in Malay, Javanese, and Chinese dialects. Batavia was always a mosaic, but now the edges are fraying. Tensions crackle in the markets. The Chinese quarter is still heavily policed since the massacre of 1740. Yes, that's still a memory people whisper about when the shutters close. Historians still argue whether that horror was an isolated riot or calculated racial control. Either way, the wounds never really healed. You duck into a small shop selling carved teak trinkets and Dutch-style blue ceramics. The shopkeeper, an elderly mixed-race woman with piercing eyes, doesn't smile. She sees right through you, this traveler out of time walking the ghosts of a dying colony. You pick up a tiny model of a VOC ship. The detail is impressive. The sails are rigged with tiny threads, the hull lovingly lacquered. A beautiful toy, version of something that once ruled the seas. You put it down gently. Outside, the world moves on. Batavia, for all its decay, is still a hub. Java is still rich, fertile, and strategic. And the Dutch know it. They may have lost Brazil, the Cape, Ceylon, but Java? That's the prize they can't let go, so they tighten the noose. After the VOC's fall, the Dutch state takes over administration directly, and let's just say, the bureaucrats are no friendlier. Land taxes skyrocket. Indigenous rulers are squeezed. Harder for tribute. Resistance grows quietly at first, like roots under stone, but it won't stay quiet forever. You listen to whispers about a man named Diponegoro, a prince with fire in his eyes and dreams of expelling the Dutch. His time hasn't come yet, but it's coming. The tension is everywhere, palpable as humidity. Farmers mutter about grain shortages. Local soldiers grow weary of Dutch orders barked in languages they never chose to learn. You see graffiti scratched into a stone wall. Tana Kami, Dara Kami, our land, our blood. Meanwhile, Dutch families cling to Batavia's shell. They hold balls in wilting mansions. The orchestra plays out-of-tune waltzes while geckos skitter along cracked ceilings. They sip tea on porches screened against malaria and pretend the empire isn't collapsing around them. That's always been the Dutch way. If the ledgers look good, the screams must be somewhere else. But the ledgers don't look good anymore. The spice trade is no longer the cash cow it was. Global demand is shifting. New colonial powers, chiefly the British, are edging in. Java still produces, but profits are leaner, slower, and rebellion is a lot more expensive than monopoly. There's a fringe scholar, Dutch of course, who swears the ghosts of Vioch traders still walk the canals at night. You're not sure you believe that. But standing here in the damp twilight as cicadas scream and thunder grumbles in the distance, it's hard not to feel watched. You take a final walk through the old VOC headquarters. The portraits on the walls are faded. Governors, directors, merchants, all of them staring out with that smug 17th century look, the eyes of men who thought they owned the world. You can almost hear them whisper, "Trade must flow, order must hold, profit above all." But outside these walls, the world has changed. Order is cracking, trade routes shift, and the profits, well, they're being counted elsewhere now, as you step out into the heavy evening rain. Batavia's streets shimmer under the lamplight. The puddles ripple with passing rickshaws and tired sandals. Java remains, but the Dutch grip on it is slipping. They just haven't admitted it yet. You walk the scorched streets of Amsterdam where smoke clings to the rooftops like a ghost that refuses to leave. It's 1795, and the once proud capital of the Dutch Republic feels like it's been caught in its own trap. Opulence turned to kindling, maps of faraway lands curling up in the flames. You pass a canal now thick with ash. Even the water looks tired. This isn't one of those textbook revolutions, the kind with guillotines or mobs storming palaces. It's quieter than that, more like watching the tide pull back before it swallows the coast. The Batavian Revolution, they'll call it, and yes, it's inspired by France. Liberty, equality, brotherhood, with a Dutch accent and slightly better accounting. You wander through a government building where portraits hang askew and ledgers smolder in fireplaces. The States General, the merchant-led ruling body that once steered a global empire, has fallen. Replaced by the Batavian Republic, a client state of revolutionary France. Client state, by the way, is a polite term for satellite with less autonomy than a well-behaved moon. The Dutch elite didn't fight very hard. Many of them saw which way the wind was blowing, especially when the French army crossed the frozen Waal River with speed and drama. Some even welcomed the revolution, hoping for reforms, a new constitution, maybe more than 5 people voting, this time. But others, those who had profited most from empire, just locked their doors and prayed their fortunes wouldn't be confiscated. You step inside a banking house, or what's left of one. The marble counters are chipped, and the safes, open and empty. Once this place handled gold from Suriname, diamonds from South Africa, pearls from Ceylon. Now, rats mostly, and a ledger half-burned, the ink running like tears. Historians still argue whether Amsterdam burned with purpose or by accident during those chaotic weeks of transition. Some blame looters, others, careless revolutionaries. But most agree on this. The city never quite recovered, not just physically, but spiritually. The fire wasn't just in the buildings. It was in the foundation of Dutch identity. This belief that they were merchants of reason, gods of trade, rulers without swords. Suddenly none of it seemed true. And then there's the economy. Always the Dutch obsession. You look at the old exchange, where men once screamed over the price of spices and shipping futures. It's quiet now. Trade has collapsed. The VOC is gone. The fleet is rusting. Colonial profits are down. And France, for all its revolutionary charm, is a very expensive friend, even more bitter. The Bank of Amsterdam, once the envy of Europe, is teetering. You pass its grand stone steps and pause at the door, now guarded by a man who looks like he hasn't slept in a week. In its heyday, this was the model of financial stability. But like a gambler who bet on the wrong empire, it's unraveling. The gold that backed it? Questionable. The paper? Worth less by the hour. And still the canals sparkle. That's the strange part. You'd think ruin would look uglier. But Amsterdam remains physically beautiful, its gabled houses and shimmering water as elegant as ever. It's the people who have changed. You pass families speaking in hushed tones, eyes darting, as if afraid the past might recognize them. In a tavern near the harbor, you find the walls covered in maps, but someone has gone through and crossed out all the Dutch colonies lost in the last decade. The Caribbean is a scribble, Sri Lanka, erased, the Cape, gone. Only Java remains intact. Barely. You sip a bitter ale and overhear an old sailor muttering about the good years, when ships left by the dozens and returned heavier than they'd left. When Batavia meant wealth, not malaria. When the Heren 16 were feared, not forgotten. He tells a joke you barely catch. Something about Rembrandt, painting himself poor while the spice lords got richer. Everyone laughs, but it's the sad kind, the kind you make when you know the punchline is your own decline. You wander back out and find a street where the paving stones are being torn up. Not for repair, but for kindling. A city built on global commerce is now burning itself to stay warm. There's an irony there so sharp you could slice peppercorns with it. Still, even in this collapse, something flickers. A pamphlet blows past your feet. It speaks of rights, of a new republic, of voting and education and reform. The dream of reinvention, of remaking the Netherlands as something more democratic, more just, less empire, more equality. It's a noble hope. Though history, you know, has a way of taxing idealism. You stand at the edge of a canal and stare down into the water. The reflection is murky, rippling. You see Amsterdam, but not the Amsterdam of golden ages. This is a city in flux, a place where the wealth of the world once landed, now struggling to keep the lights on. And somewhere in the background, a church bell rings, not triumphantly, but like a memory. You wake to the sound of insects chirping, heat already pressing in from all sides. It's Java again, but the air feels different now. Tense, heavy, like the moment before a summer storm cracks the sky open. The Dutch are still here, make no mistake. Their flags fly above government buildings, their soldiers drill in the sun, their paperwork smothers local markets like mildew. But underneath, something moves, something restless. The old VOC system is gone, but the new colonial regime isn't kinder, just better organized. You walk past a Dutch administrator's office where ceiling fans whir above desks stacked with maps and ledgers. Java has become a directly governed colony of the Dutch state. No more trading charters, no more profit-sharing companies, just bureaucracy and taxes. Lots and lots of taxes. And people are angry. You hike a narrow road that winds past rice fields and volcanic slopes. The kind of view travel influencers would post if they could ignore the colonial guard stationed nearby. Here in the heart of Java, you start hearing the name whispered like a spell. Diponegoro. Prince Diponegoro is not just a man, he's a fuse. Born to the royal family of Yogyakarta, raised in spiritual traditions and a keen sense of injustice, he's watched his people suffer under Dutch land reforms and seen sacred ground desecrated by a colonial road project. That's the final insult. You stand at the edge of that road, unfinished, now overgrown with weeds, and feel the quiet fury etched into the soil. In 1825, Diponegoro launches what will become the Java War. And it's not just a skirmish, it's a full-scale rebellion, one of the bloodiest in Dutch colonial history. You crouch in a forest where guerrilla fighters hide beneath banana leaves and chant verses from the Quran before ambushing Dutch patrols. The war stretches across Java for 5 long years. Historians still argue whether the Dutch truly understood what they were facing. They called it a local uprising, a regional issue, maybe even a religious flare-up. But to many Javanese, it was a war of liberation. Diponegoro wasn't just resisting taxes. He was fighting for culture, faith, dignity. You feel it in the way farmers turn warriors, in the way women smuggle messages under their sarongs, in the way temples become command posts. You visit a Dutch garrison, now mostly a ruin, where young soldiers once baked under the tropical sun, riding home to their families in Leiden and Rotterdam. They had no idea what they were walking into. The Dutch lost over 8,000 troops in battle, and more than 20,000 to disease. Java's death toll? Easily over 200,000. Let that number float for a moment. It's not a war. It's a wound. And yet, despite the bloodshed, the Dutch eventually win. How? Brute force, better logistics, and a strategy that involved hunting Diponegoro down like a ghost. You stand at the site of his capture in 1830. It was a trick. He came to negotiate and they arrested him. Classic move. The prince is exiled to Sulawesi, where he will die decades later in a damp cell. A freedom fighter turned prisoner, turned symbol. Still, you get the sense that the Dutch won the war but lost something else. Their legitimacy, perhaps. Or the illusion that Java would quietly accept its chains forever. In the aftermath, the Dutch double down. If there's one thing an empire does well, it's learn how to cling tighter. The cultivation system is born. Not a farming technique, but a tax policy dressed in fancier clothes. Javanese farmers are now forced to grow export crops like sugar and indigo instead of rice. You walk through one of these government-supervised plantations where a boy no older than 12 wades waist-deep in a field of cash crops he'll never taste. The system is efficient. It turns Java into one of the most profitable colonies in the world. Amsterdam's economy briefly stabilizes on the backs of Javanese labor. Dutch officials praise the system's order and productivity, but you can see the truth in the villagers' eyes. Hunger spreads, land becomes toxic, culture erodes. It's not just control, it's extraction. You visit a school built by the colonial government. It's meant to teach Western values to a small, elite group of native students. On the blackboard, Latin script replaces traditional Javanese writing. You overhear a teacher explaining European concepts of progress and civilization, while outside a farmer beats the earth with a stick because his rice harvest failed, again. There's a crack forming between those who buy into Colonial, assimilation, and those who resist it from the inside. Meanwhile, back in the Netherlands, the Java War becomes a kind of cautionary tale. Portraits of Diponegoro start appearing, not as a villain, but almost romanticized, a tragic figure. Dutch writers wax poetic about the last noble enemy. It's easier to admire your opponents after you've crushed them, apparently. You end your journey on a hilltop, overlooking the sprawling Javanese countryside. The fields are orderly, but the people in them are not. Beneath the surface, there's still unrest. The seeds of future rebellion. The Dutch might have tightened their grip, but Java breathes. It remembers, and it waits. You drift now through the stately calm of 19th century Amsterdam, but something's off. The streets are quieter, the mansions are dimmer. It's like walking through a once booming theater after the final act, velvet curtains still heavy with dust. The empire still technically stands, but the spotlight has moved on. In drawing rooms and university halls, people begin whispering about a most peculiar concept, Dutch tolerance. Ah yes, tolerantie. A word painted proudly across centuries of Dutch identity. You remember how they wore it like a badge. Home to Jews fleeing Spain, haven for Protestants exiled from England, and of course, birthplace of philosophers like Spinoza who dared to question everything, even God, with a twinkle in their eye. But here's the sleepy, eyebrow-raising twist. Tolerance didn't mean equality. It meant selective breathing room on the state's terms. You sip coffee at a canal-side cafe, bitter, a little burnt, and watch students argue over pamphlets. There's a new energy in the air. The 1800s have unleashed a storm of reformers, theologians and proto-socialists all poking at the skeletons stuffed into colonial closets. Did the Golden Age really mean freedom, or just freedom for some? Take the case of the Sephardic Jews, welcomed in the 1600s, allowed to build synagogues, become diamond traders, doctors, scholars, but also taxed heavily, banned from public, office, and quietly told which neighborhoods were acceptable. A velvet glove still hides a steel rule, and don't even get the philosophers started. You walk past a bookstore where a dusty copy of Spinoza's Ethics peeks from behind a Bible. He was excommunicated for his ideas, called an atheist, a danger, a heretic. And yet today, the Dutch parade his name like a prize. Tolerance, it seems, often grows fonder in hindsight. Historians still argue whether this reputation for open-mindedness was real or carefully managed. The Netherlands did, after all, tolerate slavery for centuries. You remember the ships we sailed through the Caribbean Triangle, the plantations of Suriname, the chained bodies in VOC holds. Not exactly the tolerant utopia promised on tourist brochures. You step into one of those old canal mansions now turned museum. The wood floors creak underfoot. Oil paintings of sea captains and smug merchants stare down at you, their eyes all-knowing. The audio guide cheerfully discusses their art collection, not so much the source of their wealth. You reach a gilded study filled with books and porcelain. Lovely. But where's the room for the enslaved child who probably scrubbed those floors? History has a habit of leaving certain people out of the frame. In the East Indies, tolerance took on even stranger shapes. You peek inside a colonial schoolroom in Batavia, where local elites were taught European classics and then returned home to serve the Dutch administration. One part assimilation, one part cultural erasure. Native religions, exotic curiosities, native languages, spoken in whispers while Dutch flowed through the courts and counting houses, and yet the myth of Dutch tolerance only grew, especially when compared to other colonial powers. At least we're not like the Belgians, someone will say, or the British. It's the kind of bar lowering that feels familiar in every century, but the facade is cracking. You walk past a newspaper press where typesetters are laying down ink hotter than a spice shipment. Writers begin questioning the morality of empire. The famed novel Max Havelaar, published in 1860, explodes like a cannonball through Dutch respectability. You skim the pages, part satire, part confession, all indictment. It reveals the cruelty of the cultivation system in Java, the hypocrisy of Dutch administrators, the vast gap between Dutch ideals and colonial reality. It's a bestseller. Suddenly, middle-class readers who've never left Amsterdam are picturing Javanese farmers starving to grow indigo for their curtains. The book forces them to really see the cost of empire. Not just in coins or cargo, but in bones and blood. You linger at a lecture hall where young minds are stirring. Universities debate colonial ethics. Some call for reform. Others whisper about independence. For the first time in centuries, empire is not a source of pride, but a subject of doubt. And yet it's complicated. Many Dutch still view their colonies as a civilizing mission. Schools are being built, roads paved, hospitals opened. They don't see exploitation, they see progress. But when you ask the people at the receiving end, well, their answers are less glowing. You stroll through a Protestant mission station in Sumatra. On the wall hangs a painting of Jesus with unmistakably European features, arms outstretched over a brown-skinned congregation. The message is clear. Salvation comes from across the sea. You wonder how many converts actually found comfort in this or simply played along to avoid trouble. Back in the Netherlands, you watch a parade of colonial soldiers being cheered as they return home. Brass bands, flags, children waving. But there's a strangeness in the cheers. They feel forced, like a country trying to convince itself that its empire still means something. At night, you climb to the top of a windmill on the city's edge. Below, the canals still gleam. But it's a different glow now. Less gold, more candle. The wealth is fading, and in its place, stories begin to rise, messier, harder to digest, but truer. Tolerance? Maybe, but always filtered through power. Conditional, limited, strategic. The Netherlands is starting to look in the mirror. And the reflection isn't as flattering as it used to be. You drift south now, following warm winds and the faint rustle of palm fronds. A salty breeze brushes your cheek, tinged with something heavier. Molasses, maybe? No, sugar. But not the kind that sweetens tea. The kind that lingers in scars, sung in hushed voices across the Caribbean. You've arrived in the Dutch Antilles, curved, islands like punctuation marks in the sea, trailing behind centuries of trade, trauma, and tenacity. The ships are gone, but the echoes are not. You land on Curacao, boots crunching on coral dust, and hear the stories stir. It's a small island, just 40 miles long, but oh, what history it holds. The Dutch didn't plant sugar here, they trafficked it. This was a hub, a depot, a human turnstile where enslaved Africans were unloaded, cataloged, and sold before being dispersed to plantations across the Americas. You step inside a restored landhuis, a colonial plantation house with peeling pastel walls and ghost still air. There's a rusted iron collar on display, delicate as a noose. You lean in closer. It's not part of the tour, but the walls remember. The creak of chains, the shouts of overseers, the prayers muttered into the soil. This wasn't a home. It was an outpost of control. Historians still argue whether Curacao was more of a market than a plantation economy. But to those who lived it, the distinction didn't matter. Pain moved in all directions. You cross to Bonaire and hear about salt, pans where enslaved workers spent their days barefoot in burning pools, harvesting the very crystals that preserved Dutch herring. You imagine that? The daily sting of salt in your cracked skin while ships loaded with fish and spices set sail for wealthy tables half a world away. On St. Eustatius, known once as the Golden Rock, you tread ground so packed with the remnants of trade that even the ocean floor shimmers with sunken coins and broken glass. The island, barely a speck on most maps, was a buzzing free port in the 18th century. You picture the warehouses, rum, tobacco, sugar, weapons, all changing hands faster than wind. One British officer famously said that more business happened on Statia in a day than in London in a week. Not bad for an island you can cross in half an hour, but with trade came war. You watch as cannon fire echoes from distant hills. The island changed hands over 20 times between European powers, sometimes flipped like a poker chip mid-game. You wonder if anyone ever asked the locals what flag they wanted over their heads. Spoiler, they didn't. By the 19th century, abolition is in the air, but moving painfully slow. The Dutch abolished the slave trade in 1814, but slavery itself? Not until 1863. You walk through the forests of Saba and hear what the oral histories say. Emancipation was a date on paper, but not always in practice. Some enslaved people weren't, even told they were free. Others were forced to work out their freedom for years afterward. Like a subscription, you can't cancel. The government even paid compensation, not to the formerly enslaved, but to their owners. Yes. You pause. Let that settle. Wealthy planters were reimbursed for their loss of property. No reparations, just receipts. You visit a church on Aruba, once segregated, now mostly silent. Outside, a cemetery tells quieter stories. Weather-worn headstones, carved in papiamento Dutch, Spanish. A blend of languages shaped by trade, coercion, and survival. You kneel to read one inscription and realize it's a lullaby. Someone wanted to be remembered gently despite the world they lived in. Meanwhile, back in the Netherlands, the Caribbean was often an afterthought. Not grand enough to make the front pages, not gold-rich like the East Indies, but critical nonetheless. The triangle trade ran on their backs. Amsterdam's wealth, those canal houses, those ivory inlaid desks, owed more than a thank you note to the Antilles. Still, official Dutch narratives long downplayed this role. Museums glossed over it. Schoolbooks gave it a paragraph or two, then rushed off to Rembrandt and naval charts. Even the name Netherlands Antilles kept the islands lumped together like an appendix, important enough to keep, inconvenient enough to ignore. And yet, the islands never stopped speaking. You walk into a small Curaçaoan bookstore and thumb through poetry, memoir, protest. There's fire here. There's rhythm. The language dances even when it grieves. You hear stories of resistance, quiet and loud, revolts that flared and failed, songs that outlived their singers, and an unbroken line of grandmothers who taught their children that history wasn't just something written, it was remembered. You board a boat just before sunset and drift past Willemstad's candy-colored harbor front. The buildings gleam like icing, but you know better now. You know what built them. Not just merchants and dock workers, but those who had no choice. The sun dips low. The waves hush. The air smells of salt and something older, like the breath of time itself. The Dutch Caribbean doesn't shout its story. It hums it, in the winds that swirl between islands, in the coral that grew around shipwrecks, in the quiet pride of people who remember even when history tried to forget. You wander slowly through the cobbled streets of Amsterdam, but something feels off. There's an eerie quiet. The windows of the tall canal houses seem darker. Ash still clings to corners of brick. Here, where the smell of herring once mixed with wax and cinnamon, you catch the acrid scent of soot. The air is heavy with loss, and if you tilt your head just right, you can almost hear the hum of a city trying to forget the sound of fire. Amsterdam in ashes. Not a metaphor this time, real roaring, choking fire. It started as they often do, a spark in a crowded wooden district, a forgotten lantern, a twist of wind. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Amsterdam had grown bloated on its own prosperity. Every inch of its concentric canals was packed with warehouses, guild halls and merchant homes. A jewel, yes, but one built of flammable timber, old thatch, and narrow alleys. Like a bonfire waiting for a match. You pass the husk of a building that once housed the East India Company's local offices. Or maybe it's just your mind layering past over present again. There are so many burned-out shells. It's hard to know what once was what. Flames didn't discriminate. Rich, poor, merchant, dockhand. All watched their livelihoods go up in smoke. It wasn't just literal fire that scorched Amsterdam, of course. Financial fire was licking at its ledgers, too. By the late 1700s, the golden facade was cracking. Wars had drained the treasury. Britain's growing naval strength had kicked the Dutch down a peg, or 5. And the Dutch economy? Still deeply tied to colonial exploitation, still wheezing forward on sugar, spice, and human cargo, but increasingly out of step with the new world order forming around it. This wasn't the bustling center of power it once was. It was a beautiful antique, a museum city before anyone thought to charge admission. You feel it in the way locals shuffle past you with a kind of practiced neutrality, like they've accepted the decline and are too proud to name it. A statue catches your eye, tall, dignified, resolute. One of the merchant heroes of the age. Maybe it's Joost van den Vondel or Cornelis de Graaf. Doesn't matter. You can't help but wonder, how many of these marble men watched their legacy smolder while still pretending they had everything under control? Here's a quirky twist. During one of the major fires, it's said that a warehouse full of nutmeg and cloves caught flame and filled entire blocks with the scent of roasted spice. Picture it. A city on fire and people coughing not just from smoke but from clouds of cinnamon. Somewhere between bakery and battlefield. That's Amsterdam for you. Never just tragedy. Always a touch of the surreal. And amid the flames, the banks tried to stay open. Because of course they did. The Amsterdam Whistle Bank, the central bank that once defined European finance, kept its doors open long past its prime, guarding silver bars in vaults even as confidence crumbled outside. It's the sort of loyalty that's admirable until you realize it's to coin, not to community. Historians still argue whether the financial decline of Amsterdam was inevitable, whether a city that tethered its fate so tightly to colonial extraction and maritime dominance could have evolved in time to survive the economic revolutions of the 19th century. Some say yes, with better leadership. Others? They see a ticking time bomb that went off a little late. You duck into an alley, the walls charred, graffiti scratched into the stone, layered, ancient. There's a symbol etched in chalk, a crude sailing ship with flames under it. A message or just a doodle? Either way, it fits. The great ships of the VOC no longer sit proudly in harbor. They rust in foreign docks or rot in memory. The yards that once built them now echo with smaller work. Fishing boats, repairs, whispers. And still, amid all this, the canal mansions shine. Some were untouched by flame. Others were rebuilt, quickly, defiantly, with borrowed money or blood-soaked, capital from colonies still clinging on. You knock gently on one of their heavy wooden doors. Just imagining, of course. You wonder what stories echo inside. A merchant father lecturing his son about trade routes while ignoring the smoke rising over the harbor. A widow polishing her silver, pretending not to see the flames outside. There's a softness now in the city's bones. Not weakness, just wear. You can feel it as you walk. The way the bridges groan slightly underfoot. The way the shutters hang crooked. Proud, but tired. You feel a strange affection growing. Not for the empire, but for the aftermath. The people who stayed, who rebuilt, who whispered stories to their children about when Amsterdam ruled the seas and the sun rose on Dutch gold. The city never fully collapsed. That's the trick. It faded. It let the fires burn, swept the ashes, and opened another cheese shop. It pivoted, from empire to culture, from spice trade to tourism, from world domination to making the best pancake in Europe. You respect the hustle, and in the archives down narrow stairwells in brick libraries sit the records, ledgers, manifests, letters from governors, and pleas from slaves. All of it kept. That's the strange mercy of Amsterdam's fire. It burned the buildings, yes, but not the paper. The memories remain, stacked in dusty boxes, waiting for someone like you to remember. You linger on a bridge, watching the dark water reflect orange lantern light. No more galleons, just bicycles and boats full of laughing students. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the ghostly creak of a ship's rope, the jangle of coins, the crackle of firewood. Or was that cannon fire? Amsterdam in ashes, but still standing, still whispering. You wake with the scent of cloves still ghosting your nose, but now the air feels heavier, thicker, tropical. The light is different too, low and golden, but filtered through a haze of heat and dust. You're back in Java, but this isn't the Java of sweet tea and clever trade deals anymore. No, this time it feels like the walls are closing in. Java tightens the noose. The Dutch, once casual overlords with their breezy contracts and bribes, are getting serious. The empire is shrinking, sure, but here they're digging in. With the Atlantic world slipping from their fingers and Amsterdam dimming, the Indies become the last place where they can pretend to be emperors. You hear it before you see it. The stomp of boots, the rattle of sabers, the bark of Dutch officers shouting orders in a language still foreign here after centuries. Soldiers march down the jungle paths, not just VOC mercenaries anymore, but crown troops. You're not watching a trading company protect its assets. You're watching a nation claw back relevance with powder and policy. This shift, this tightening, has a name. It's called the culture stencil, the cultivation system. It's as cheerful as it sounds. Under this system, Javanese peasants are now required to grow cash crops, sugar, indigo, coffee, on a portion of their land, not for themselves, but for the Netherlands, and not for money either. It's technically in lieu of taxes, which is a lovely bureaucratic way to say, give us your time, labor, and food so we can sell it to Europe. Historians still argue whether this was a form of benevolent modernization or outright economic slavery. Some call it efficient, others call it extractive. You watch a farmer stoop in a rice field, tired eyes squinting in the sun, and the debate seems more than academic. The effects were seismic. Java's economy was reshaped not around the needs of its people, but the appetites of Europe. Coffee plantations replaced food crops, leading to famines. Whole villages turned into supply chains. The Dutch raked in vast profits. Some years, up to a third of the Netherlands' entire state budget came from Java. One island became the lifeline of a failing empire. No wonder they held on so tight. You pause in a small village watching children play with carved wooden toys under the gaze of a mission school. Dutch language lessons drift from the windows. A kind of soft power, right? Schools, churches, the occasional medical clinic. But you can't help noticing that every lesson is about obedience. Every hymn sounds a bit like a national anthem, and the medicine comes with paperwork attached. Even the landscape seems subdued. Forests once wild and tangled are now patterned with plantations. Rivers once free now flow past Dutch mills and canals. The island's heartbeat is still there, but muffled, like it's speaking through a damp cloth. You pass through Yogyakarta and Surakarta, courts that once dazzled with their own power. Now the sultans are dressed in batik but speak Dutch behind palace doors. They've been turned into administrators of their own subjugation, rewarded with titles, gold, and the illusion of control. It's empire by co-optation, and it works disturbingly. Well, quirky tidbit time. At the height of the cultivation system, Dutch civil servants in Java were required to file reports on how many coffee beans were collected, down to the kilogram. The obsession with paperwork was so intense, one governor was nicknamed the Counting Ghost. His legacy? A lot of well-organized misery. As you walk, you notice something else. Whispers of unrest. Not loud yet, but persistent. A market vendor curses under his breath as soldiers pass. A teacher hesitates before describing the Netherlands as the motherland. You see graffiti etched into a well, a Javanese Chris stabbing a Dutch flag. Symbolic violence, sure, but symbols have a way of foreshadowing the real thing. You remember Batavia? Once the polished jewel of Dutch Asia? It's decaying now. Disease, heat, and decades of bad urban planning have turned it into a place most Europeans avoid unless absolutely necessary. The new Dutch elite live in the hills, in cooler towns like Buitenzorg, now Bogor, pretending the city that built their empire doesn't exist anymore, out of sight, out of tropical disease. Yet despite all this, despite the control, the extraction, the bureaucracy, the Dutch never truly own Java. They hold it like a rope, always tense, always tightening, but they never make it theirs. The culture, the language, the spirit of the island remains defiantly Indonesian. You see it in the way ceremonies are still performed at night in secret, in the way stories are passed mouth to ear, not written in Dutch ink, in the quiet resistance of survival. You come to a colonial outpost, whitewashed and smug. Inside, a Dutch official is explaining to a visitor how civilizing the Javanese is a noble mission. He gestures proudly to a map of plantations and profit margins. But outside his window, a group of locals light incense and bow their heads, not to him, not to his king, but to something older, something rooted. This is the paradox of empire. Control is never as complete as it feels. You can build roads, assign quotas, and train teachers. But hearts, minds, those slip through cracks like smoke. You end the day high on a hill overlooking the Java Sea. Ships still sail, smaller now, humbler. The sun sets red and heavy. Somewhere below, a Dutch clerk updates a ledger, tallying how many barrels of coffee will ship to Rotterdam next week. He thinks the system is working. He doesn't see the noose pulling tighter, not just around Java, but around the Dutch dream itself. The empire holds. For now. You step into a room full of light. Natural light filtered through grand windows, glinting off marble floors and polished wood. A hush settles over the space, the kind that demands reverence. But this isn't a church or palace. It's a gallery, one of many. All across the Netherlands, buildings like this one now hold the heart of the Dutch Golden Age. But hearts can be messy. And this one, it's been carefully edited. The art of forgetting. On the walls, you see proud ships cutting through the sea, merchant captains posing stiffly in velvet, tables overflowing with grapes, silver, and porcelain, bounty from trade, from conquest, from somewhere else. You gaze into the eyes of painted burghers and wealthy widows, their glances frozen in time. Their hands clutch books, pearls, globes, objects that whisper, "We ruled. We mattered." But what's missing is louder than what's here. There's no painting of a slave ship's hold, no mural of burned Banda villages, no still life of a plantation's back-breaking rhythm. You wander past frames that showcase wealth with exquisite detail, but somehow the blood that built it all never quite made it onto the canvas. You tilt your head and lean closer. In one painting, a small dark-skinned boy holds a tray, eyes cast down, body stylized like a prop. Historians still debate whether this was a symbol of status or an actual servant owned by the sitter. Either way, he doesn't have a name. He doesn't get a plaque. And this is how forgetting begins, not with lies, but with selective memory. A quiet, curatorial decision, a cropping of the frame. You remember that joke from earlier about Dutch accounting and war? Turns out they did. The same thing with history. They balance the books, just not the whole story. In the 19th century, the Netherlands leaned hard into its image as a peaceful, pragmatic, tolerant little kingdom. The kind of place where everyone bikes and eats stroopwafels and has opinions about cheese. And that's not wrong, but it's incomplete. It's like showing a still life of tulips without mentioning the blood-soaked soil they once bloomed in. You walk into another room, a grand one, the Rijksmuseum maybe, and there it is. Rembrandt's The Night Watch. Glorious, chaotic, iconic. Musketmen in motion, a girl with a chicken, light and shadow dancing. It's a masterwork, but you can't help wondering what those men were protecting. A city? A trade? An empire? You half expect one of them to turn and wink, whispering, "It wasn't all parades, you know." Here's a quirky little fact. In the 1800s, as the Netherlands tried to rebuild its image after colonial scandals and war losses, school textbooks included very little about the East Indies. One geography book reportedly referred to the islands as useful and pleasant lands, with no mention of forced labor. An entire generation learned only the tidy half of the story. Even today, scholars wrestle with this amnesia. Some say it's cultural humility. Dutch people aren't boastful. Others suggest it's deliberate, a national habit of slipping past guilt with a shrug and a proverb. Act normal, the saying goes. That's crazy enough. And maybe forgetting is a kind of national coping strategy. You stroll through, a smaller exhibit now, this one curated more recently. It's bolder, interactive. One display lets you trace trade routes: cotton, coffee, copper, people. Another room plays audio from letters written by enslaved Javanese workers, their voices reimagined by actors. It's powerful, uncomfortable, honest. A young docent walks past and smiles nervously. "This room is new," she says softly. "Some visitors don't love it." You nod. Of course they don't. Remembering is harder than forgetting. Remembering demands questions. It means staring at a gorgeous Dutch still life and asking, who paid for the sugar in that bowl? It means looking at the grandeur of Amsterdam's canal homes and thinking, what stories were silenced behind these walls? You pass into a final gallery, dimly lit. A projection on the wall scrolls through the names of Dutch colonies, battles, trade routes. But here's the thing, the scroll never ends. Because empire leaves traces, not just in land and laws, but in language, cuisine, trauma. Echoes stretch into Suriname, into Curaçao, into Indonesia, into South Africa, into streets named after merchants, into wealth inherited but unexplained. And yet, not all is cynicism. You see a small group of students sketching in notebooks. One's drawing a VOC ship. Another, she's writing next to a quote from a Javanese rebel. There's curiosity. In their eyes, maybe even hope. You leave the museum, blinking into daylight. The streets outside buzz with modern life. Bikes jingle. Coffee shops smell like cinnamon again. But now, with every brick, every step along the canal, you see more than just charming Europe. You see ghosts. Not malicious ones, just quiet, insistent, presences. They don't want revenge, just memory. And so, the art of forgetting begins to crack. Slowly, imperfectly. With each new exhibit, each student question, each name recovered. The brushstrokes of history being redrawn, less pretty perhaps, but more whole. The trade winds still blow in the Antilles, but they no longer carry fleets of galleons with Dutch flags fluttering proudly. They carry something quieter now. Stories, memories, and songs born across turquoise waters and white-sanded shores. You stand barefoot on a warm beach, and the sun feels good on your shoulders. But this isn't a postcard. It's a place layered. In history, sugar, screams, and silence. Echoes in the Antilles. You're in Curaçao now, maybe, or Aruba, or perhaps tiny St. Eustatius, Statia, as the locals call it. It doesn't really matter which. The islands are each unique, but the echoes ring the same. Dutch Empire was here, and it left behind more than just language and liqueur. Back then, these islands were the gears in a vast colonial machine. Ships, left from Amsterdam and Zealand full of weapons, textiles, and ambition. They arrived in West Africa, picked up enslaved human cargo, and then offloaded it onto the plantation economies of the Caribbean and Brazil. Then the sugar, coffee, and tobacco made their way back to Europe. Round and round it went, the triangular trade, lubricated by rum and sealed with cannon smoke. You walk through the old port district and it's beautiful. Pastel buildings in neat rows, waves lapping at coral stone foundations. But you know better now. That warehouse once held chained men. That church heard prayers spoken under duress. That plaza? It saw auctions where human lives were measured in guilders. Curaçao was the headquarters for the Dutch West India Company's slave trade operations. Between the mid-1600s and early 1800s, thousands of enslaved Africans were brought through this harbor, sold like livestock, and shipped off to the plantations. Some stayed here, building the very walls that now host tourists sipping cocktails and posing for selfies under sun hats. Quirky detail incoming, there's a fort in Willemstad called Fort Amsterdam, because of course there is, where you can. Still see a cannonball lodged in the governor's wall, fired by a British ship in the 1800s. It's become a charming little oddity. Look, guides say, the island survived. But the island also survived something far heavier than iron and gunpowder. It survived centuries of silence. You walk further inland now, into old plantations turned museums. You touch sun-bleached stone. Feel how rough it is against your skin. The sugar mills are long quiet, but you can almost hear the echoes. Creaking pulleys, the crack of whips, the distant cries of laborers bent over endless rows of cane. It's a hard thing to hold in your heart, but you do. Locals have been holding it for generations, and that's the thing they didn't forget. Oral histories, songs, and dances kept truth alive. You sit under a tamarind tree and listen to a woman tell the story of Tula, the leader of a major slave revolt in Curaçao in 1795. He believed, foolishly or nobly, historians still argue which, that the promises of liberty whispered during the French Revolution applied to him too. He led hundreds in a bold uprising. It was crushed. He was tortured and executed. But his name is still sung. Today, he's a national hero. You visit the Tula Museum, housed in a restored plantation house. It's humble but powerful. Walls are lined with artifacts, chains, letters, photographs from later decades. A quiet film plays in the background. You watch visitors move slowly, some in silence, others softly translating the captions for grandparents or children, remembering together. There's something else too, something modern and unexpected. Carnival. You find yourself swept into the colorful chaos. Feathers, glitter, drums so loud your ribs vibrate. It seems like just a party until someone leans over and says, "This is survival, you know. Resistance with rhythm." They explain how many of the dances and costumes trace back to Africa through slavery, through colonial rule, through shame, and, now, through pride. Echoes don't always have to haunt. Sometimes they dance, but not everything is healed. You pass a statue of a Dutch governor, stoic, bronzed, with an inscription that politely omits his role in expanding the slave trade. Locals have petitioned for its removal. Others argue it's part of history. The debate simmers. A school nearby just introduced a new curriculum that includes Caribbean perspectives on colonialism. Some parents are thrilled, others, less so. You sense the tension, this uneasy truce between past and present. And so the islands echo not just with memory, but with questions. What should be remembered? Who decides? Can a people move forward without knowing the full weight of where they've been? You climb a hill near the coast and look out over the sea. The water is impossibly blue. A pelican dives, then floats peacefully. And beneath that perfect surface, you know, lie shipwrecks. Some accidental, some sunk on purpose, filled with chained men who didn't survive the Middle Passage. The sea remembers even when people don't. As you head back into town, the warm wind carries smells of salt and fried plantains. The present is very much alive here, modern, proud, complicated. You pass signs in Dutch, papiamentu, English, Spanish. A layered language for a layered past. In the end, the Dutch Antilles aren't just footnotes. They're not just rum ads and cruise stops. They're living reminders that empire was never just something that happened over there. It shaped lives, identities, economies, and its echoes are still bouncing off walls that tourists rarely see. You pause by the harbor at dusk. Lights flicker on in the waterfront cafes. Laughter, music, and the sound of waves blend into a soft, soothing hum. It would be easy to stop thinking here, but you don't. You remember. You're walking along a canal again, no longer on a tropical island, no VOC deck, no jungle outpost. Just a quiet Dutch street, cobbled and clean, the brickwork damp from the recent drizzle. The air smells faintly of moss and roasted coffee. Bicycles click by like metronomes. And lining the water, almost too perfectly spaced, are the grand houses. These are the houses that wealth built. Or more precisely, these are the houses that blood built, gilded by trade, fortified with ledgers, and held upright by generations who knew exactly what not to ask. You tip your head back to take in the height of them. 4 stories, gabled roofs, leaded glass. Some lean ever so slightly forward, their warped beams shifting over centuries. But still, they stand proud. You pass one with a plaque outside. It belonged to a VOC director once. The name is there, etched in stone, right above a date and a charming floral motif. What the plaque doesn't say? This director owned hundreds of slaves in the East Indies. Another built his fortune monopolizing nutmeg with scorched earth policies in Banda. That marble floor inside? Paid for by forced labor. It's easy to forget in the charm. The way the sunlight reflects off the water. The way the ducks seem utterly unconcerned with empire. You step through one of the doorways. Many of these buildings are museums now, or converted to offices or luxurious homes again. Inside, it's quiet. The wood groans faintly under your feet. The decor is tasteful, neutral, respectful. A docent greets you with a brochure and a smile. The family crest on the ceiling above your head, once a symbol of trade dominance. Now it's just an Instagrammable detail. You begin to recognize something. The silence in these walls isn't neglect, it's design. The kind of design that puts the mahogany paneling front and center but forgets to mention that the mahogany was chopped, carried, and carved by enslaved hands. You run your fingers across it anyway. It's smooth. Too smooth. In the corner, there's a painting of a ship again. There's always a ship. It's not storming a beach or unloading cargo. It's sailing at golden hour, proud sails swollen, almost peaceful. It's not lying to you, but it's not telling the full truth either. Here's a mainstream fact you may not have expected. At the peak of the Golden Age, Amsterdam's canal ring, the Grachtengordel, was the richest urban center on the planet. The Bank of Amsterdam functioned like an early central bank. Dutch finance was so influential that their practices shaped international trade policy for centuries. But here's the fringe bit. Some of those very banks issued securities backed by plantations and slaves. In modern terms, the same system that invented safe banking also made owning people a safer investment. You stare at the high ceilings and think, well, that's one way to compound interest. Outside again, you follow the canal as it curves, then cuts, then spills into open squares where street musicians play under statues. One of the statues is new, Tula again, his likeness installed here too, thousands of kilometers from Curacao. The plaque tells a fuller story this time. Progress? Maybe. A beginning, at least. As you wander, you pass protests. Not loud ones, just a quiet group holding signs outside a university. The signs call for decolonizing the curriculum. One reads, "No more glorious amnesia." You pause, nod, keep walking. There's a small exhibit being set up by the canal. Young artists, mostly, showcasing pieces inspired by the Dutch Empire. One installation catches your eye. A mirrored VOC logo, cracked down the middle. Another is a canvas smeared with brown sugar and ash. The artist explains it's about sweetness and destruction. You tell her it smells oddly nostalgic. She laughs and says, "That's the point. So here you are, in a place built on wealth that came from conquest, innovation soaked in exploitation, beauty layered over brutality. It's dizzying. You wonder if the Dutch themselves truly see it, this complex tapestry, this knot of profit and pain. Many do. Some don't. Most are still figuring it out. You reach the edge of the city. The older buildings give way to sleek, glass towers. The Netherlands now prides itself on equality, sustainability, and tech. And those aren't lies, they're just chapters, recent ones, built on pages written long ago. You take a final look back at the old canal houses, their stoops, their symmetry, their secrets, and you think of all the wealth they hold, not just in euros or florins or Bitcoin portfolios, but in memory, that most delicate and defiant currency. The Dutch Golden Age didn't just build ships or paint masterpieces, it built walls. Around cities, around fortunes, around uncomfortable truths. But those walls are softening now, cracking a little, letting in air, light, questions, and sometimes, if you stand still enough, you can hear the gold groan. The streets quiet, the wind softens, lights twinkle on above the canals, their reflections stretching like brushstrokes across the water. You feel your shoulders relax as the world hushes down to a gentle exhale. All around you are echoes, faint, persistent, and finally heard. Ships docked long ago, fortresses crumbling in the jungle, ledgers turning to dust in old archives, and people, so many people, forgotten, remembered, resisted, reclaimed. You lean back now, let your eyelids grow heavy, let the stories settle. History doesn't end. It ripples. The Dutch Golden Age didn't vanish, it melted into the bricks, the banks, the biases. It lives in spice jars, in borrowed words, in last names passed down across oceans. It lives in the shine and in the shadows. But you saw it. You walked through it. You questioned what was painted and what was left out. You turned stones, read between lines, whispered names others had long silenced. That matters. And maybe, just maybe, those stories, complicated, messy, essential, will help shape something softer, something truer, something new. So now let it all fade. The sails, the sugar, the gold, drift gently through the canals of memory, past candlelight and tide, past empire and echoes. Close your eyes, steady your breath, and feel the weight lift. You've made the journey. You've remembered. Good. Night, sweet dreams.